At Vandenberg's Annex 4, the zero-G drop chamber hangs like a polished lung inside the concrete, an oval cylinder lined with honeycomb plates and ripstop nets that will never be needed if the math is right. The cradle, nickel-silver ribs, carbon sling, adjustable occipital rest, cradles the pilot with the hesitant tenderness of a machine pretending to understand anatomy. Cables feed into it the way roots find water. Around the chamber, the Oracle array thrums at a register just shy of audible. Sapphire glass, 9 vectorized shutters, a ring of ultra-fast imagers that drink light faster than thought can spend it. The air smells like lemon wipe and vacuum grease. A technician shuffles a deck of anti-static cue cards because having something to shuffle calms his hands. Someone coughs into a sleeve. The pilot recites a checklist with the offhand intimacy of ritual. Posture neutral, breath slow, tongue off teeth, shoulders heavy, wrists free. Blink normally unless instructed. Lock gaze on the dot when it appears. Do not track the dot when it jumps. Allow the eyes to do what eyes do when surprise punches time. No one says the word experiment. The laminated placards say evaluation and capture cycle and saccadic latency mapping. Even the acronym that keeps the money flowing avoids menace. Ocular response autonomous capture for liminal events, Oracle, because someone in procurement liked the poetry of it and no one wanted to argue. It is easier to say Oracle than to say what everyone here privately believes, that the cameras catch what shouldn't have a surface to be caught. The drop begins with a whisper of decompression, and a clunk in the gimbal mounts. In the observation bay, a set of jittery LEDs count down in fractional seconds. The cradle slides down its rails and then seems to stop sliding at all, as if it has remembered how to forget weight. The pilot's limbs loosen in the sling. The soft helmet's rim presses his cheeks inward just enough to make his mouth look strange, almost childlike. The calibration that appears on the interior visor, no bigger than a pinprick of sea glass green. His eyes fix. The pupils swell and shrink in tiny tides, negotiating luminance with the automated shutter's wicked dance. Oracle drinks frames. The timestamps pour. Frame 0000 is a right. It is the promise that the world still coheres. At 0000, the pilot's pupil is its proper architecture, a night well in a char brown. The iris shows its topography, radial furrows, crypts like melted wax, a single nevus at 8 o'clock that the baseline team argued about for 20 minutes last week because on one camera it looked like dust. The eyelashes get a thin crescent of shadow. There's a film of tear, the faint reflection of the calibration. A ghost coin in the black. It is a human, eye caught in its own unself-consciousness. It is the photograph that says, yes, this is the man we put in the cradle. The imager ticks forward 1 delta, not a full thousand a second, but some thinner slice you could not balance on a knife. Frame 0001 arrives like a door that leads to another identical door, except when you open it something colder stands behind it. It is still an eye, still under the same visor, still collared by the same lashes, but the architecture has moved to another country. The iris is different. The color is a deeper green that drags gray through it like weather. The nevus at 8 is gone. In its place, a starburst striation issues from pupil at 2 o'clock, a pale wedge. So crisp, even the technician who knows better leans closer, as if his nearness could blur it back to reason. Most telling is the pupil's contour. Not a perfect circle, but the microscopic eccentricity that every ophthalmologist reads like a signature has been replaced by another signature entirely. Someone else is looking out from the same coordinates. No one says it aloud. The pilot cannot see his own frames, and the visor has nothing to show but the dot. But in the observation bay, 3 bodies tilt in synchrony like iron filings in a field. The lead researcher lifts her hand and then lowers it because she does not have a gesture for this. She glances at the second monitor, where Oracle's inference console translates photons into categorized hunches. It offers none. The label space has no word for exchanged. They let the capture continue, because stopping would be confession. The dot jumps. The pilot's eyes do what eyes do in the instant before attention can protest. The saccade is a whip crack. 80 degrees per second, a motor program older than memory. Frames cascade like cards, 0002 through 0020, a river of pupils mid-flight. Lids narrowing and relaxing. Reflections smearing and resolving into new coins of light. Some frames of the pilot unmistakable. The nevus returns. The brown reasserts itself. The microsymmetry of the pupil's edge wears its familiar notch. Other frames are not him. Green, gray. A tread of darker limbal ring that the pilot never had. A few are worse. Not him, and not the other person either. But someone else entirely. A third iris with a ragged rehearsal of crypts and a darker fleck at 5. If you isolate them, their sequence makes a map no one should trust. If you watch them at rate, the eye is a stutter between identities too fast to be born. The drop ends. The cradle rises. Gravity returns with its humbling tenderness. The pilot looks nauseated in the gentle way trained bodies look nauseated. He closes his mouth, swallows, breathes and counts. Opens his mouth again at count 4. He reports light pressure behind the eyes. A taste of copper. A feeling like someone just said his name from behind a door. He does not report seeing anything unusual because his job is to stare at a dot and not invent constellations in its wake. The technician takes the cue cards and puts them away like holy objects. The researcher pulls off her gloves and sets them on the table, as if each finger might say something if given time. They replay the sequence without the interpolation smoothing. At single frame step, the eye leaps between anatomies as if borrowing. The lead researcher scrolls back to the last third of the capture and stops at a frame where the lid is falling. It is the other iris there, the gray-green with the starburst wedge. She marks it. She scrolls forward to a frame where a reflection crosses the cornea, the wash of a wave in glass, and for 12 pixels of reflection curves against an edge that should be a circle but is instead a hexagon, just imperfect enough to register. She marks it. She opens a baseline registry and runs a match. Protocol says the array is only tied to Annex 4, but Oracle does not remember the boundaries of funding proposals when it is hungry. It pushes against the registry like a dog at a gate. The match returns with an error code that means the database is there, and it listened, but what it heard did not fit the forms. It returns, however, an echo. There is structure here. There is a correspondence the labels cannot name. The pilot sits in the debrief with a paper cup he does not drink from. He is asked to draw how the dot moved, and produces a line that looks like a path through an orchard. He is asked whether he felt time hiccup, and says no by habit, and yes by honesty, and then laughs because both words in his mouth taste like the same admission. He reports the taste of copper again. Someone notes it without lifting their head. There is a recording no one is supposed to keep, a room mic intended for safety only, the sort of microphone that will be blamed when this transcript is found. It catches the pilot's breathing and the small, damp clicking when he opens his mouth to speak. It catches the wristband against the metal lip of the cradle when his hand twitches at the jump. It catches something else, a faint high stir inside the sturdy array, a sound like wires thinking. When they boost it, it is just noise and artifacts, comb-filtered hiss, the usual polite ghost of a live room. When they do not boost it, when they let it sit at its own smallness, it is a whisper that does not pick an address to travel to. It is a question that threads the walls. Between runs, they loosen the cradle and adjust the visor, and the pilot asks if he can blink harder. The lead says blink, however life asks you to blink. Her joke doesn't land, and she is glad. She does not want to discover she knows how to be funny here. On the second drop, they switch the dot for a face, a standard neutral human face, because saccades behave differently when eyes meet eyes. The face is intentionally generic, a collage of average. The pilot fixes his gaze on the bridge of the nose, as instructed. The array drinks again. The first frame is a face reflected in a cornea, a tiny stale moon in a curved sky. The second frame is a face of the pilot, but not as reflection. A superimposed iris that is not currently attached to him looks back through him as if the visor were a window into an adjacent room, where similar things happen at slightly different pace. After the second run, cooling fans tattle the heat they've stolen. The technician opens a panel and puts his palm near the exhaust, not touching, just feeling the lessons rise. The lead pulls up the 4 suspect frames that everyone will pretend are not the reason they joined this project and lines them beside the pilot's onboarding photos. The differences are not subtle, but they are precise, and precision has a way of making transgression feel clinical. She thinks of a phrase the briefing forbade, identity swap. She files it under things not to say, right there with the old campfire lie. It looked right at me. They try one more cycle. The pilot's breath settles into its discipline. He asks, finally, whether anyone else has ever had 0001 look like that. The lead says the data are ongoing, which is a lie that is not a lie. The truth is that, yes, in a nocturnal test with a different cradle and a different visor and a different terrified body, frame 0001 belonged to an eye that belonged to a woman who died 12 years ago over water that never gives back what falls into it. The truth is that sometimes the first step off the edge is into footprints already there. The truth is that Oracle never promised to predict. It promised to capture, and capture could be an act of theft. The lights dim to the sequence Oracle likes. The dot comes back. The eye obliges, hands over its reflexes like keys. Somewhere outside, beyond the recirculation roar and the bureaucratic quiet, night is just a local agreement about the sun. Inside, time is a series of frames making a suggestion about motion. The cameras take what they're offered faster than the offering can be understood. Frame 0000 does its anchoring work again, patient, unmiraculous, a proof of the pilot's continued ownership. Frame 0001 is once again an error in someone's nomenclature and an accuracy in someone else's hunger. The other iris returns. The starburst wedge glints like a cut in a green cloth. The edges line a contour learned elsewhere. The pupil opens, and for one stupid blink of microtime the aperture does not admit light, so much as return it, as if the eye were not an organ but a door, and the room on the other side forgot to be dark when it closed. When they stop, the pilot weeps without the salt. Tears do not come. His face arranges itself into the shape we make when our bodies remember how to confess. But the ducks do not deliver. He laughs softly at the wrongness, and the laugh sounds like a knot pulled through. He asks if anyone else hears the thin sound. No one answers, and everyone does. The technician, who shuffled the cue cards because it helped, puts them away with careful indifference. The lead watches 0001 again in silence and places her finger on the screen where the wedge begins, as if she could smudge that pale burst into something she knows how to name. She does not touch. She lowers her hand. Behind the tempered glass, the frame does not care what she hopes it is. There will be reports with their lonely grammar. There will be a meeting about calibration drift and lens bloom. There will be an email using the word artifact 6 times in one paragraph and never meaning painting. But for the 3 humans who stood inside the room where the array hummed and the cradle rose, the memory will not be the graphs. It will be the pause between 0000 and 0001, the feeling of a floor learning to be a ceiling, the way the eye became a place where 2 different lives took turns being the same gaze in the same fraction of a second. Later, when the pilot lies in the dark and tries not to stare at anything, he will see the dot again, and behind it, just for a breath, he will feel the polite pressure being looked at back. He will taste copper and think he has bitten his tongue. He will touch his cheek and find it dry. In Annex 4, the chamber will sleep in its straps, and Oracle will sit with its fans wound down to a whisper, holding inside its cold stomach a sequence of frames that prove nothing and refuse to be ordinary. Playback reveals an impossible angle because the world has decided, briefly, to explain itself in a way that feels like a dare. The feed rolls. No one breathes. Instead of the usual corneal sheen and reflections of instrument lights, the image begins in velvet black, not absence but interior. Then a thin crescent of brightness opens, as if a shutter somewhere at the back of the head were lifting. The frame resolves not into the chamber, not into the visor, but past all of that, through it, as if the camera has taken up residence behind the pilot's retina and is looking outward through the living lens, through the aqueous, to the tear film that has no salt today. Microstructures bloom. The vascular tracer of the choroid makes a red jungle of periphery. The granular henna of the retinal pigment epithelium stipples a dim. The optic disc is a pale moon at the edge of a world that should never be seen from this side. In front of it all, the dome of the cornea turns into a window on the room, and beyond the visor's inner surface, that commands attention floats like a star pinned to a firmament made of instructions. There is a measurable miracle of optics. Out-of-focus instrument LED smear into bokeh that carries the exact pattern of the array's hexagonal aperture grid. There is the unmeasurable insult. A faint parallax shift that should not be possible unless the point of view is physically displaced from a camera's mount by a distance inside a skull. Someone makes a sound like paper caving gently under a thumb. Someone else grips the back of a chair and then remembers dignity and lets go. The technician, who tells his hands to stay still and never wins, forgets the cue cards for first time this week and stares with his mouth open in a way that will embarrass him tonight. Lead physicist Dr. Sarah Wynne halts the test the way you stop a thing that might be breathing. She does not shout. She says stop in a voice trained to cross rooms and reach only the ears it needs. Oracle listens because Oracle always listens. The capture shutters freeze. The drop cradle stills at a point between fall and rise. The pilot hangs, blink half finished. Muscles micro-firing as their contract with gravity are renegotiated. Sarah lifts a hand that could have been a conductor's or a surgeon's in another life and taps the console for a hard pause. All systems commit to memory what they can. The buffers spill like a pocket turned inside out. Security badges lock the room with the gentle violence of system privilege. The strike plates catch. The status lights along the lintel go from friendly green to a red that flatters nothing. Somewhere beyond the concrete, a relay closes and a policy takes effect. Phones already surrendered at the door now feel, in the remembered weight of pockets like contraband dreams. The observation bay window dims one additional stop, not to hide them from anyone, but to shrink the outside world to the size of this room and its facts. Everyone step back on the consoles, Sarah says, and the room obeys with the slight time lag that reveals surprise. She types a string that looks like a prayer if you do not read code, and looks like code if you do not pray. The playback stops where she needs it. The impossible frame, the IS viewport, the sight line that should only exist as metaphor. She moves to the pilot channel and speaks into the intercom with professional softness that grew from crisis and then learned to live elsewhere. Hold steady. We are pausing to assess a display issue. Breathe normally. The pilot says copy, and it sounds like he is speaking from the bottom of a wishing well. His breath is audible, a silk tearing softly and then repaired. They roll the last 4 seconds again in slow time. At first the perspective is as expected. Chamber, visor, the clean geometry of a lab that has scrubbed its secrets into protocol. Then the world shucks its shell. The view recedes into the eye and then out through it, as if the light, impatient with surfaces, has elected to report from the other side. The optic nerve head is there for a blink too long. The arterial branches lay their forked signature. A faint shimmer across the fovea hints at the living chemistry that makes sight a chemical recitation. Then the room outside is visible again, not through glass but through tissue, edges gentle by aqueous refraction. Corners curved, everything wearing the slight warmth of blood. Sarah's mind tracks 2 rails at once. One rail is discipline. Catalog the anomalies, protect the subject, contain the event. The other rail is a part of her that once, as a child, pressed a shell to her ear and believed the ocean could fit in there. And that part is speaking now in the quickened grammar of wonder and threat. She flags technicals, the lens equation misbehaving, the effective focal length that says an eye is a camera, but does not consider the camera could be an eye. She flags human, the pilot's continued absence of tears, the copper taste he mentioned, the headache he didn't call a headache. She flags ontology and puts a question mark there big enough to lash a theory to. Seal perimeter, she tells the system, and the room's HVAC size into a different pattern meant for people who will be here longer than they had planned. The technician starts to ask whether they should power down the array, then decides not to, then decides he should be the kind of person who asks anyway, and asks. No, Sarah says. Not yet. Powering down would kill some of the data in the volatile nerves of the machine. It would change the room from a witness to a sealed vault, and she needs a witness right now. The others in the team find their places along the curve of crisis. The junior analyst opens the image stack in a different viewer, and the frame still shows the same impossible perspective, which does not solve anything, but confirms that the problem is not merely presentation. The safety officer checks the pilot's vitals on the secondary channel, and notes a pulse that has climbed a small hill and is resting there. The ocular surgeon on consult, who came here to sip coffee and provide gravitas, leans forward until his tie hangs like a pendulum trying to time this moment. That's the fundus, he says softly, as if naming it might scold it back into privacy. That's the inside. Sarah magnifies the image. The blood vessels pixelate and then surrender clarity to mathematics. Still, their angles and ratios sing the same anatomy every textbook comes. She marks the optic disc margin. She marks a glint across the inner limiting membrane that, in a person with tears, would be a castle of sparkles, but here is a bare line. She drags a rectangle across the center to isolate the foveal pit and the frame world beyond it. Oracle's own window, the little universe where an eye is asked to prove it knows how to jump. If this is a composing artifact, the junior analyst begins, and Sarah cuts gently. Then it will be repeatable. She rewinds 10 frames and advances one at a time. The transition is not a smash cut, but a slide, as if the instrument's point of view and the eye's point of view negotiated custody in a space too small to stand up in. For 3 frames, the 2 perspectives coexist in an ugly truce. The corneal reflection sits where it should, while beneath it, the vascular map of an interior surface insists on its own logic. Then the room wins. Then the interior wins again. Then the compromise ends, and the eye's truth takes the camera's place. It is not a trick of mirrors. There are no mirrors here except the ones biology built before stories. In the cradle, the pilot whispers that his left ear feels full. The safety officer records it and tells him to yawn gently if he needs to equalize. The pilot does. The audio picks up a small, private pop. In the room with the locked door, nobody moves too quickly, because moving quickly will let them pretend this is normal. On the recording, under the thrum of fans and the mild tinnitus of electronics, a silence gathers that is not the absence of sound but the presence of attention. Sarah hears it and does not look for it. She just registers the way the hair on her arms chooses to be honest. She thinks of the earlier 0001 frame and its other person's iris and pattern. Starburst wedged like a frost fracture that decided to live where Nevis used to. She thinks of the nociceptors that should be screaming and aren't. She thinks of the word aperture, which has always pleased her, an opening through which something else becomes possible. Pilot, she says, using his call sign because names are also apertures and must be managed. We're going to bring you up. Stay relaxed. Keep gaze neutral. The cradle hums and remembers weight. He rises as if coaxed from sleep. When the locks on his harness release, he hesitates, as if afraid he might spill. He keeps his eyes forward and down, not at the dot, not at people. He swallows twice and tries not to apologize for anything his body did in there. Sarah keeps the room sealed. She knows what will happen outside the door. Calls counsel, the invocation protocols written by people who thought they had already imagined the worst that equipment could do. She will meet that world in 5 minutes, and in those 5 minutes, she decides to be entirely here. She plays the frame again at actual speed. The impossible angle hangs for less than a blink. It is by duration nothing. By meaning, it is a hallway without walls. One of the monitors flags security routine completed. The badge tree shows green where it should show green and gray where it should show offsite. The technician, suddenly conscious of his own breathing, tries to make each inhalation look like something he would do on purpose. The junior analyst says, not meaning to be heard, it's beautiful, and then is afraid of the word beautiful and says louder, it's clear, as if clarity were a moral position. Sarah thinks of retinas in medical school, the way she learned to see the living wallpaper the back of the eye with a hand lens and a cooperative friend. She remembers the first time she saw the optic disc and felt she was looking at a well in a winter field. She remembers thinking, this is where the world becomes a brain. Now she is confronted with an image that reverses the pilgrimage. The brain has stepped back to let the world be seen from the place that usually only receives. It is an inversion that crosses origin stories with engineering diagrams. It is a lens telling a sensor, you stand there, I'll stand here. She sends a snapshot of frame to the isolated evidence vault, double hash, metadata sealed with the kind of tears the pilot cannot make. She annotates nothing in that copy. She writes nothing but time and place and the digital smell of the equipment that saw it. On the working copy, she draws 3 small arrows in gray and labels them for the record. Optic disc, temporal arcades, fovea. She does not label the world outside the eye. She does not write it. If the future reads this, it will know that part by its own light. Okay, She says finally, to the room, to the machine, to the idea that observation is an act and not a posture. We proceed to safe shutdown. We do not overwrite buffers. We do not export to personal devices. We do not speak outside this room until we have language that deserves what we saw. It is almost a prayer and almost a threat. The team nods in a rhythm that makes them briefly acquire. The room unlocks when she says her name to the door. Badges return autonomy with a cheerful beat that does not understand context. The hallway outside smells like cold coffee and policy. A liaison is already walking toward her with a face arranged into a shape that says, "I am here to help you manage your miracle into paperwork." Sarah steps through and pauses at the threshold. She looks back once at the frame pause on the central screen, the world seen from behind the retina, the dots shining in the middle of a living tunnel. The micro-tremors an image that insists it is not a capture, but participation. "Document everything," she says without turning, "and someone please tell him he did well." The technician nods and goes to the pilot with a cup of water that will taste faintly metallic and real. The junior analyst begins to type the kind of description that opens with an apology for its own insufficiency and ends with numbers that will never be enough. Oracle hums and cools and, for a moment, sounds like it is counting not seconds but chances. They arrive without the sound of arrival, as if the hallway itself produced in the way a mouth produces a word when it's tired of waiting to be spoken. Two security officers in blues that read as black, a civilian in a suit the color of unasked questions, and behind them the liaison whose email signature has been hovering at the edges of everyone's inbox for months like a forecast. Department of Defense, Strategic Technologies Coordination, Colonel Mason Greer. The name is a press release even when spoken softly. He moves like someone who has learned to walk across rooms full of witnesses without casting a shadow on anything that might later be subpoenaed. "Dr. Wynn," he says, and the way he shapes doctor turns a word into both courtesy and inventory. Sarah straightens without meaning to. The team arranges itself by seniority and guilt. The pilot sits with his water and his careful breathing, and a look that tries to be small in a room where nothing is allowed to be small. Greer does not ask what they saw. He tells the room what it is going to be called. Effective immediately, this project is reclassified under the compartment codename Parallax. He says the word, as if it has always been a word. The civilian in the gray suit slides a folder onto the console with the frictionless confidence of someone who has practiced sliding folders in the mirror. Parallax sits on the tab in black on white, a typography that looks like it was designed to be photographed from the wrong angle. The word is neat and unafraid. It pretends not to know that parallax is the difference between where you are and where you think you are when you measure. Sarah glances at the Oracle console, which still holds the impossible frame in its paused throat. Parallax, she thinks. Of course. Name the thing after the trick of seeing two truths at once. Name it after the error that is also a tool. Greer's voice continues with the soft edges of a blade kept in velvet. All media created within the scope of the former Oracle Annex activities are now subject to Title 10 handling and Title 18 penalties. Physical assets will be collected for secure transit. Digital assets will be cloned to government systems. Personal notes will be surrendered for duplication and return. This is not punitive, he adds, and something in the air shrugs. It's heritage protection. You found something valuable. Our job is to keep value from being vandalized by inexperience. He nods at the blues. They open gray cases with the intimacy of ritual. Foam nests, tamper-evident seals, Faraday sleeves that gleam like fish scales under bad lighting. The technician, who can make a camera sensor sing and a power supply purr, feels unreasonably protective when a stranger's hand hovers near his keyboards. He steps aside anyway. The junior analyst logs out of 3 windows with fingers that suddenly insist on being supervised. A cart rolls in, already wearing its evidence bags like medals. Someone produces the forms that make all of this into a story told in boxes and lines. Chain of custody. Sign and initial. Time and date. Printed name. The pen Sarah takes is heavy enough to be a persuasion device. It leaves a line that is too black, the kind of black that looks like it might stain intent. She signs because she is a scientist with clearance and a mortgage and a taste for doing the work again tomorrow. She signs because refusing would not keep anything inside this room. It would only escort her outside it. The civilian in gray does the conversational equivalent of tapping a glass. Dr. Wynne. Colonel Greer would like to ensure we're aligned on messaging for internal notes and any external inquiries. The term of art for what you recorded is optical recursion artifact. Please use it consistently. Optical recursion artifact. The junior analyst repeats, obediently, as if learning a new muscle. He writes it down on a sticky note and then, embarrassed, crumples a sticky note and pockets it, unwilling to let the phrase sit unattended on a desk. Sarah tastes the word artifact and thinks of museums and dust and little placards that say provenance uncertain. Recursion is correct in a way that feels like a dare. Optical is safe, a bright adjective that sits near cameras and far from people. She does not argue the phrase. She adds to the shelf of names the world uses when it would rather point than touch. Aligned, she says. Greer watches signatures accrue. He does not loom. Looming would suggest he cares whether these people see him as someone who looms. He reads a room as data. A liaison from Parallax will be embedded for duration, he says, meaning himself without saying himself. Your research will continue under revised protocols. You will have resources. You will have discretion. You will have the relief of not needing to invent the language for what you saw. He lets the last line rest on the table between them like a kindness. Sarah recognizes a kindness that has been field-tested. The blues begin their delicate pillage. Drives are tagged with numbers that bite on first glance and dissolve on second. The Oracle array, still warm, is photograph labeled and wrapped in a Faraday shawl that dims its hum to memory. The room becomes an orchard's cape of barcodes. Someone produces an evidence camera whose shutter sound is fake, but really good. Each click lands like an alibi. The pilot's visor goes into a sleeve. Even the cue cards, shuffled and reshuffled to calm weather in the technician's hands, are collected and bagged as if the ink might have absorbed an indecent amount of meaning. When the NDAs arrive, they are both familiar and obscene. Sarah has signed 100 of them, a species treaty between curiosity and caution. This one has teeth. It speaks of grave harm to national security with the swagger of a phrase that has opened many doors and closed many mouths. It lists penalties as if reading a grocery list. The word treason sits there like a stone in soup, flavoring everything without ever being bitten. The civilian in gray adopts a voice you would use with a neighbor who needs their tree trimmed. These are standard augmented restrictions for compartmented projects involving sensitive sense of modalities. He makes sensitive sound like the opposite of fragile. Please initial each page and sign at the end. Sarah flips to the end because she has learned that the end is where promises try to become enforceable. There it is, the paragraph that dares a signer to imagine the worst version of themselves and then punishes them for it just in case. She sets the document down and looks at Greer. "Colonel," she says, and finds that the shape of his rank fits into her mouth with more heat than she intended. "We are scientists. You called us because we saw something and asked a better question than the last guy. Threatening treason in a room like this feels like a way of saying you want the question to stop." Greer does not flinch. He is not a flinching man. He is a calculating one. "Dr. Wynne, I'm not threatening you. I'm warning the future on your behalf." He leans a fraction closer, enough to be a confidence without being an intimacy. You will not be the first person to underestimate how frighteningly interesting your work is to people who do not have your ethics or your patience. People inside, people outside, people with money whose curiosity expresses itself like hunger. My job is to keep you asking the right questions long enough to get answers that can endure. To do that, I need you alive, employed, and legally unspectacular. The word treason is a fence. It's ugly. It keeps the wolves out and the sheep in. We can argue about the metaphor later. He straightens, and the metaphor, wolves and sheep, sits down between them and pretends to be furniture. Sarah, initial S, page by page, feeling the small rebellion of deciding that her signature is not compliance. It is a receipt. When she reaches the end, she signs in a hand steadier than she expected. The junior analyst signs with a flourish that surprises him. The technician signs as if he is apologizing to each letter. The ocular surgeon signs with old-school cursive that makes the page look haunted by a grandmother. A security officer approaches the pilot with the last of the sleeves. "Your wristband," he says, and the pilot tenses the way people tense when reminded that their body has been tagged by belonging. He unclasps it and watches it go into the gray mouth of the bag. He touches his cheek, maybe to check for tears out of habit, and finds it, again dry. Greer hands Sarah a new badge clip. It is the same size and shape as the old clip. It simply carries a different future. Parallax has the kind of font that thinks it's not a font. "This will get you where you need to go," he says. "It will refuse you where you don't." "What about our language?" Sarah asks, unable to stop herself. "When my team writes its notes tonight, what do we call the thing we saw? The frame that looks from behind." Greer answers with the speed of a man who cleared this question an hour ago. "Optical recursion artifact," he says, and the phrase is absurd and correct and something the world can swallow without choking. You may also refer to secondary manifestations as off-axis morphological anomalies. Do not use the terms identity swap, possession, entity, intrusion, or any language that suggests intentionality. If you believe intentionality is present, route that belief through me first. "Belief?" The junior analyst murmurs before good sense catches up. "We're not a church." Greer smiles in a way that shows he has been in rooms where that line landed harder. "I prefer evidence," he says, "and containment while we learn how to collect it without breaking our instruments or ourselves." The cart fills. The screen empties. The room's memory thins like soup stretched for guests who arrived hungry. Sarah watches the Faraday bag swallow the objects that have been her morning companions for a year and feels the strange relief of being robbed by someone who will catalog your losses and return most of them cleaner. She thinks of the impossible angle, the corridor of tissue and light, the dot shining at the end of an eye. She wonders whether calling it an artifact will protect it from people who would rather make it a miracle or a weapon. Greer gives them a schedule as if giving them a map. Debrief in 90. Protocol briefing in 180. Limited home release by 2100 with escorts, if desired. Reassembly at 0900 tomorrow under Parallax banner. Do not discuss specifics with spouses, partners, houseplants, or pets, he adds. Not because he thinks they will, but because a joke is a ribbon that you tie around a box labeled "Do Not Open." If contacted by anyone who is not me or wearing that badge, he points to his own chest and the new word there. Record the time and report immediately. Do not, under any circumstance, send data to yourself for safekeeping. The safest place for your data is the machine you do not own. The pilot stands at last, slow and careful, as if gravity might again forget him if he makes any sudden moves. He asks if he will be allowed to sleep. "We encourage it," Greer says. "Dreams are cheaper than tests." It sounds almost kind and almost like the warning it is. As they file the last disc into its sleeve, the technician reaches for the cue cards and habit and finds his pocket empty. He feels suddenly foolish for missing the weight of paper more than he misses the heat of the array. Sarah rests her hand on the console where the impossible frame had glowed and is startled by the desire to apologize to a screen. She removes her hand as if the apology might leave a print. Greer lingers at the threshold, inventorying faces. "You did well today," he says, not with warmth but with accuracy. "You were present. Keep being present." He taps the door jamb twice, as if telling the building a secret. To Sarah, he adds, almost privately, "There will be people who come to you hungry for your awe. Do not feed them. Feed the work." When the door closes behind Parallax and its rolling gray harvest, Annex 4 exhales a long institutional breath. The room looks the same in layout and the opposite in meaning. The team sits with their new nouns and their old verbs. Sarah opens a fresh notebook because computers are obedient, but paper understands secrecy in a way that doesn't need encryption. At the top of the page, she writes, "Parallax, optical recursion artifact, Annex 4. She pauses, then adds, smaller, because it helps to tell the truth somewhere. "We were seen." She tears the page out and feeds it to the shredder. Then she takes the next page and writes the same line without the last sentence. This one stays. She caps her pen and thinks, without faith and without despair, that names are lenses, and lenses can either focus or lie. Parallax, optical recursion artifact. She tries them on like glasses in a dim shop and promises herself that, whatever these words do to the world outside, inside this room they will be temporary. The thing itself will keep its own name until it tells them. They rebuild the room inside a smaller room, as if containment could be nested like dolls until the last doll holds nothing a policy can name. The Faraday cage is a clean geometry set down over a cradle in the console, like a bell jar over a living flame. Copper mesh and a lattice tight enough to thwart radio gossip. Seams soldered, and then soldered again as if mistrust were a kind of weather. Floor panels lift to accept ground straps. A braided bus thick as a child's wrist snakes to an earth rod that dives into concrete, and then farther, seeking an old, slow honesty the building no longer remembers. The overhead ducting hums at a lower duty cycle, because even air can carry rumors. The cage door swings on hinges with the careful self-respect of something that knows its purpose is to be closed. They labor in a choreography learned on other day for other reasons. Remove, isolate, verify, repeat. Each cable that crosses the threshold of the mesh passes through a filter block as heavy as a promise. Power lines acquire chokes that make them purr like patient cats. Optical fibers get their own smug exemptions and are still briefly suspected. The visor is swapped for an identical visor that has never met their pilot's face. The pilot submits to a new baseline. Visual acuity, pupil gauge, intraocular pressure, all the small dignities and indignities of being the place where a question meets a body. The technician, deprived of his cue cards, counts the hex bolts in the floor plate and decides there are 62, then recounts and discovers there are 63, then refuses to count a third time in case the number would prefer not to be known. Sarah walks the perimeter of the mesh with a multimeter, like a dowser, who trusts numbers more than water. Continuity pings back in the bright confidence of a tone that only knows how to say yes. She inventories a new hypothesis tree she has permitted herself to grow overnight, and prunes 3 branches that require miracles in their first sentence. The term optical recursion artifact sits in her head, like a book she hasn't yet decided to read. Parallax sits beside it and touches it by accident on purpose. Greer stands outside the cage with his hands behind his back in the posture of a man who refuses to make fists in public. He has brought a different liaison today, a woman whose smile is perfectly ironed. Her badge says nothing about her inside life. When they are ready, the cage door closes with sound that decides a world. The room inside the room acquires a new silence, not louder, just exact. Oracle's hum shifts, too, as if the absence of stray fields has removed a flavor it had learned to enjoy. The pilot breathes on the intercom, and they can hear the shape of the cage in his breath, a slight hollowness, as if he were speaking from inside a copper lung. Sarah's voice goes into him as a gentle weather. "We're going to run the same sequence," she says. "Hold steady. Follow the dot. Blink like a person." The dot blooms and becomes faithful. The first frames anchor to sanity like ship cleats on old wood. The eye obeys. The capture begins. There is a moment. There is always a moment where everyone in the room remembers that they joined this work because they believe the universe will be more beautiful up close, and then discover that beauty can look like trespass when it forgets which way the door swings. Then the transition arrives. It arrives without flourish, without apology. A slide in the grammar's sight, an impossible angle is impossible again. The camera looking outward from behind the retina, the fundus a brief red river delta, the optic disc a pale round decoration of origin, the world beyond a curved theater lit by a command star. Sarah does not let her body celebrate. She thinks it instead, repeatability. The junior analyst whispers repeatability and does not know he said it aloud. The ocular surgeon takes off his glasses to make sure his eyes understand they are allowed to disbelieve and believe simultaneously. Greer's expression changes hardly at all. It shifts the way a horizon shifts when a mountain remembers it once was fire. They slow the playback and step through the frames again, hungry for the same meal plated twice. And then something additional, something small and disobedient, arrives as if to remind them that controls control nothing that wants to live. In a sequence where the eye's interior has taken the stage, reflections arrange themselves on a tear film like coins tossed for luck. Instrument lights smear and sharpen in the curvature that makes optics humble. Among those reflections lives another, a ghost geometry that is not a light, not a dot, not an array. It is a lab but from a vantage that no one has ever stood in, an angle above the ceiling, above the ducting, above the girders, as if the ceiling tiles were a lake and someone were a bird content to float on it and look down. The reflection is unmistakable once seen and impossible to unsee. The cage's mesh writes itself faintly across in the way of a grid superimposed on a map. They're not interfering. A coordinate system for disbelief. They can pick out the bright rectangle of the observation window. They can see the crown of Sarah's head turn slightly as she watches the monitor. They can see the wide shoulder of Greer canted toward the door. The vantage point is a place that does not exist in the list of places where a lens could be. Sarah stops the frames with a keystroke that sounds like an oath cut into metal. "Mark that," she says, and the analyst's hands, grateful for instruction, begin to earn their keep. She zooms the reflection, knowing that images punish zooming, and doing it anyway. Pixel stares appear, but beyond them persists the fact. The room from above, the view that belongs to nothing in this room. Do we have any borescope feeds, any maintenance cameras? Anything installed for inspection? She asks without looking away. The safety officer replies no, then qualifies, then returns to no. The building plan, caught up on another screen, shows duct runs and cable trays, none of which are where the vantage would need them to be. The technician, who has made a life out of hearing the difference between a hum that says yes and a hum that says not yet, leans toward the audio timeline and watches its hairline waves. He plays the track alone first, then with the volume advanced a degree at a time, not wanting to bruise the signal by wanting it too badly. The cage has simplified the room's noise. Fewer radio size, fewer itinerant beeps. What remains is the fans in the building's slow vowels and the pilot's breath counting without counting. Under that, or threaded through it, is a slender something that may be nothing and is not nothing. It has the shape of speech in the way a stone has the shape of weather. He isolates its band with filters that are less tools than prayers, and, for a heartbeat, the room becomes a chapel for sound. "Play that again," Sarah says, though she has not heard it yet. She has only felt the air choose a new posture. The analyst routes the audio to the speakers that least insult small things. The whisper arrives, close and quiet, a breath more than a word that nonetheless manages to be a word. Closer. It is neither male nor female. It is a vowel of invitation. It is a consonant of threat. It drags no room tone with it, as if the mouth that made it did not share their air. No one says entity. No one says intrusion. Greer told them which words are not to be used, and the prohibition has become a superstition, useful in its own way. The junior analyst says valiantly, "We have a coincident phoneme-like artifact," and then swallows the part himself that wants to laugh. The ocular surgeon murmurs, tinnitus, in the tone clinicians use to protect patients from their symptoms. Sarah keeps her hands open at her sides, not clenched, not pleading. "We have a voice-shaped event," she says, and feels the ugliness of the workaround. "We have to verify source path." They rerun the sequence with the pilot's mic muted. The whisper arrives anyway, tucked into the track captured by the room mic inside the cage, and again, lower now, like a suggestion practicing its own volume. Closer. They swap microphones. It returns. They cut the gain. It finds them. They shut down the intercom path to the observation bay. It becomes, if anything, more intimate. The technician disables the preamps and runs a passive capture that should produce only the cruelty of silence. The waveform shivers and articulates for a single cycle that could be a syllable and is content to be a rumor. Sarah watches the reflection again, freezes it, lays it side by side with the impossible interior vantage, wonders if the two are cousins or conspirators. The reflection is where no camera is. The voice is where no mouth is. The cage prevents what the cage knows to prevent, and the preventable things go quiet, and the remainder grows bold. She thinks about recursions, the way a function calls itself with smaller arguments until it reaches a base case and stops. She wonders what the base case is for being seen while seeing. She wonders whether the word closer is an instruction, a lure, a measurement. She wonders, treacherously, whether obeying it would change their instruments or change them. Greer steps to the mesh and does not touch it. His presence announces itself the way heat does near a wall. "Your containment works," he says, as if delivering a weather report. "What persists inside persists for reasons other than the reasons we can buy." He looks up toward the notional ceiling above the real ceiling, as if courtesy extends to places that don't exist. Proceed, he adds, and the word is half permission, half dare. They attempt to triangulate a vantage with a reflection, using geometry no one consented to and parallax that subtly feels like blasphemy against their new banner. The analyst plots vectors based on a reflected angle of the observation window's rectangle and the known radius of corneal curvature. Smears of mathematics on a board already crowded with careful lies. The intersection point hovers in a void that would be 3 meters above the drop chamber, 9 centimeters into a truss that has never held a camera and never will. Unless we're seeing a composite of micro-reflections, he begins, and Sarah nods with love for his fidelity to things that can be written down. Tag it, she says, and they tag it with an X label with a question mark that looks like a fishhook. The pilot reports an itch he cannot find. He reports a pressure like someone tapping a spoon against the back of his eye in time with a heartbeat that doesn't belong to him. He reports the absence of salt and, for the first time, does not try to disguise apprehension as professionalism. I can hear when I don't play it, he says. And the sentence folds in on itself like paper that contains a second shape you can only see when you hold up to the light. They lower him and lift him and lower him again, as if motion is a sedative and a diagnosis. The whisper does not care about altitude. The reflection does not care about schedules. Sarah calls up the first run's frames and the second run's frames and overlays the impossible angles, looking for the small differences that prefer to be called constants. In one, the optic disc's margin shows an afterimage line, as if the tissue has learned to expect to be looked through. In another, the foveal reflex appears as a sharper pinprick, like a star seen from a darker hill. She notes, quietly, that the living eye is adapting to being an instrument and feels suddenly protective of it the way one becomes protective of a violin that has learned a piece no one has written. They try a blindfold, metaphor made literal, an occluder placed between retina and world to see which side of the black vantage belongs to. The impossible angle survived the blindfold because it never needed light from the outside. It asked light to report from the inside, and light, traitor and friend, obliged. The reflection fades with the blindfold on, then returns when the occluder lifts, as if the not camera above the not ceiling prefers a view of people staring back. The technician, whose pocket feels oddly empty without contraband paper, turns to Greer and risks a question. Sir, if this persists, what do we call in our notes? He is aware of the absurdity. He asks anyway because language is a map and they are lost. Greer doesn't pause. You call an off-axis morphological anomaly contributing a ceiling-born phantom reflection, he says. You call the audio an unassigned narrowband voice class artifact. You do not call either of them by a name that suggests will, he says like a thing with teeth. Sarah takes a small liberty. She asks the pilot, while the dot is dim, to move his eyes slowly in a circle and then fix at the margins, to let the periphery have its turn at being central. She is not sure what she expects. She does it because some questions are doors you open to learn the size of the room beyond. The impossible angle flares into greater clarity when he looks away from the dot, as though the machinery that directs foveation refuses to accept a camera as a guest and sends it to the corners to wait its turn. The reflection, too, changes with eccentric gaze. The vantage seems to climb when the view climbs, descend when the view descends, as the perspective is not indifferent here but obedient. Closer, the whisper says again, almost amused at its own patience, almost impatient with theirs. They bring in a second cage, an absurdity worth trying, encasing the observation bay microphone in its own tiny copper chapel, and the whisper tucks itself into the pilot's channel to demonstrate that it chooses where it lives. They disable every transceiver in the suit and the cradle and the building's walls. The whisper is happy to be a rumor in a place that has sworn to hold no rumors. The reflection flickers during a moment when a fluorescent ballast tries to remember the old world, and then returns steadier when the ballast remembers obedience. The ocular surgeon, whose career has been built on the reliable strangeness of human tissue, clears his throat and offers a heresy disguised as courtesy. You may be hearing your own blood, he says to the pilot, at a frequency that suggests meaning. He is doing his part. The pilot nods because nodding is a way to say thank you for the comfort even if you cannot wear it. Sarah makes a note that is not a note, a curve with 3 dots that might be a face if you wanted it to be. When they finally stop, the cage breathes heat at them like a large animal that has permitted a rider. The copper smells faintly of fingerprints. The screens hold still in a hard-won truce between evidence and interpretation. Sarah orders an immediate dump to the vault. Separate hashes, blind signatures, the whole priesthood of integrity to protect them from themselves later. Greer makes 2 calls that are not recorded, each a single sentence that can be read 7 ways. The liaison with the iron smile writes optical recursion artifact in her notebook and underlines it twice, then draws a neat box around closer, as if boxing a word could be a spell against it. They open the cage door, and the room outside feels like weather returning after a long hospital stay. The pilot stands on legs that have remembered their prior agreements. "It felt like standing at the mouth of a cave," he says, surprised at his own sentence, and hearing the cave inhale. He waits for someone to be offended by the metaphor. No one is. Some metaphors in a room like this are just measurements laundered into human. Sarah looks up at the real ceiling, and then at the not ceiling where the reflections camera not camera had to be. She imagines a lens hung in air by nothing but attention. She imagines attention as a kind of field that cameras can enter if they are patient and stupid enough to keep their shutters open through courage and fear alike. She imagines a word closer not as a command but as a coordinate, a place where 2 lines meet and fail to pass through one another politely. They will call this repeatability. They will call the whisper a band-limited anomaly. They will write paragraphs that circle the words they wanted to say and pretend the circling is the same as arrival. And tonight, when Sarah lies down with the stiff smallness of a person who has signed her name next to treason and kept her mouth anyway, she will hear it again in the place where hearing is a suggestion the brain makes to itself. Closer, she will think of the reflection that came from above where no camera is, and she will answer nothing aloud. But inside her private cage, the part of her that once put shelter her ear and believed will take a step, not forward exactly, but toward. It is the kind of intrusion that does not announce itself with drama, only with accuracy. The frame scroll, eye interior, eye exterior, the reflection from the vantage that should not exist, the whisper that hangs like a stitching cloth, and then something interrupts the arithmetic. For one duration that cannot be politely converted into milliseconds, a black rectangle occupies the center right of the image, where there is no object in the world to justify it. It is not overlay and not dead pixels. It is geometry imposed like a verdict. Its edges are not edges in naive sense. They do not cut the room. They bend it. The line of the cradle's rail, which ought to continue across the field of view like a well-behaved sentence, approaches the rectangle's boundary and curves, as if reconsidered by a grammar you do not teach the children. The sheen on the visor's inner surface drapes toward it, as if light were a fabric and the rectangle were a drain. The dot, loyal star that it is, seems to lean infinitesimally, the way a candle flame leans toward a draft that swears it is not there. "Freeze," Sarah says, already freezing, the keystroke landing with enough force to make the plastic remember it used to be sand. The frame locks. The rectangle remains. Zoom punishes them with its staircase of blockiness, but the punishment is theatrical. The fact endures behind the pixels. Black knot thing, angles that refuse to obey Euclid in public, a perimeter that persuades photons to confess new habits. The junior analyst reflexively checks a mask layer that doesn't exist in this pipeline, then checks another thing that cannot be at fault, then stops checking and simply stands with his hands at his sides, palms wrinkling slightly, as if his body were trying to turn itself into a more sensitive instrument. Technician Luis Renteria leans forward, because leaning forward has always been his way of arguing with whatever scares him. He is the kind of person who knows the difference between a ground loop and a ghost by taste. He speaks 3 dialects of hum. He stares at the rectangle with the stubbornness of a man who has rebuilt his mother's washing machine motor 6 times for the pleasure of teaching it manners. The black seems to answer his attention by returning it, which is an absurd sentence and becomes true by accession. The mesh of the Faraday cage writes its faint lattice across the scene, but the rectangle eats the lattice where it crosses, not erasing it so much as convincing it that up is an option. The edges lends the room. The room obliges. Somewhere behind the glass, Colonel Greer makes a note with his posture. Louis does not blink. He forgets how. The small muscles around his eyes learn a new assignment called endure. The junior analyst asks, to err, whether anyone else sees a gradient, then abandons a question, because the rectangle makes a mockery of the idea that black is a single number. Sarah watches the histogram for a signature she can throw at the world like a rope. It gives her a canyon with no river. Time index, she says. Mark it. The analyst marks it. The pilot murmurs that the dot has gone soft, then corrects himself, then stops talking altogether because the softness is inside his head. The ocular surgeon breathes as if preparing to say please to an instrument that has become proud. Luis keeps his eyes open because he once read about a frog whose heart will stop if you startle it, and he has no interest in discovering the human equivalent. The rectangle's edges do not shimmer. They insist. The world near them acquires a tiredness that is not fatigue but curvature. A line that ought to be straight appears to be straight until you hold a straightness next to it and ask both to sign affidavits. Something in Luis's vestibular system complains. His stomach, loyal animal that it is, translates complaint into action. He turns away too late to make it dignified. He retches into his cupped hands and then toward the floor, and the floor receives him with its ancient tolerance. The smell fills the copper-belled cage. The pilot flinches at the sound because bodies are rehearsed to flinch when other bodies become alarming. Luis, Sarah says, steady and soft, as if the syllable has hands. Sit. Eyes down. Breathe. Greer shifts his weight no more than a centimeter. The blue at the door watches a hinge, as if it might need to understand hinges under pressure. Luis lowers himself onto the stool with the obedience of a ladder being put away. His face is the color of paper just before it is asked to take ink. He wipes his mouth with a wrist that remembered to wear a rubber band. On an auxiliary screen, a line that has been boring suddenly becomes spectacular. Luis's EEG, usually a cooling field of beta and broadband human mess, narrows into a geometry that looks designed by a vindictive watchmaker. The dominant frequency locks to a pulse that is not his. The junior analyst frowns, then smiles despite himself, then frowns again because smiling feels treasonous to the body that just vomited. Sarah, he says, voice pitched low to keep it from becoming a bell. His cortical rhythm snapped to Oracle's master clock. He brings up the array's internal time base, the crystal that imagers worship. On the overlay, the peaks are standing shoulder to shoulder. Phase alignment collapses to zero as if they had rehearsed. Luis's brain, for the duration of the rectangle's tenure, ticks like the machine. A man has become a metronome for a device, or the device has listened harder than a machine should listen to a man. Artifact, the ocular surgeon says, because responsibility is a reflex. Muscle artifact, blink contamination. Even as he says it, he knows he is lying for the right reason and the wrong one. The EMG channels sulk in their normal corners. The EOG is quiet. Luis has not blinked in a measurable way since he started staring. Log it, Sarah says, though logging occurs whether asked for or not. She flips to the audio, unwilling and compelled, and the whisper is there again, not absent, not louder, simply nearer in a way that ridicules distance. Closer, it says, and either it is pleased to be right, or it is pleased to be obeyed, or it does not know what pleasing is, and they are committing a sin of grammar by assigning it a mood. She routes the room mic to a recorder that lives inside a separate, vindictive Faraday pouch. The waveform obliges her with neat ripples that would look like a shallow lake if lakes could pronounce syllables. Shut it down, Greer says, not shouting, not needing to. Sarah nods and the sequence pauses. Not instantly, but the way a carousel does, shedding speed and decorative reluctance. The rectangle refuses to be the last thing. It sticks around half a frame longer than math says it should, and then is gone, leaving behind a room that scrambles itself back into orthodoxy with the relief of a story being told correctly again. The pilot inhales like someone surfacing. Luis closes his eyes and then opens them experimentally, as if sight might have filed a union complaint. The EEG unhooks itself from Oracle's clock with the embarrassment of a child caught borrowing clothes. It returns to human. The analyst scrolls backward to catch the frame before the rectangle appeared, and the frame before that, and the frame that had the reflection of the lab from a vantage that nobody could rent. There is no premonitory flicker, no edge ghost whispering prepare. The rectangle arrives like a stamp. Leaves like an apology no one believes. The histogram during its occupation shows a gravity well where there should be a plateau. He draws a ring there and hates himself for the poetry of the shape. Source, Sarah says. We have to prove it's not us. She enumerates possible hypocrisies. Shutter partials, rolling readout misaligned with actuator, a synchronization byte with a clock tried to kiss itself. The analyst shakes his head before she finishes because he has checked those doors already, and they are locked from the respectable side. Oracle's clock is healthy. The imagers agree like choir boys. What misbehaves is the world, or their portion of it. Luis raises his hand halfway, and then decides the gesture belongs to an earlier life. It had edges, he says, voice in that post-retch register, where everything sounds like confession. I thought they were edges. But when I kept looking, they felt curved. He shrugs. He is not a mathematician in public. Like the room was making a decision near the lines. He looks ashamed of the simile, and then more ashamed when Sarah nods, because shame plus acceptance is a chemical that makes people cry, and he will not, be the first person to cry in a room where crying is currently broken. Hydrate, the ocular surgeon says, because he needs to say something he can do. Someone brings Luis a cup, and he holds it the way you hold an heirloom. The junior analyst, giddy because terror and joy share a spinal cord, brings up the oracle clock again and lays it against Luis's EEG one more time. If you look at the microjitter, he says, tapping a cluster that looks like frost, there's a small phase walk that matches the camera's thermals. He walked with the machine. Not just the main tick, the tiny drift. He glances at Greer and regrets glancing at Greer because the liaison is a wall that registers fingerprints. Greer looks at Luis for a measured beat and then at Sarah. Document that present tense coupling as an off-instrument synchronization event, he says, as if he is asking someone to list a spare chair. Medical follows for the technician. No further exposure for him today. His eyes shift up toward the idea of a ceiling above the ceiling and do not linger. And the rectangle? Unassigned occlusion with non-Euclidean edge behavior. Sarah says, proud and disgusted with the sentence at once. Transient. Frame resident. No precursor artifact. Bending demonstrated by local line deviation and highlight curvature. We'll quantify the lensing if it will let us. She can hear herself formalizing the miracle into a checklist, filing its teeth. They try polite experiments while the room still remembers how to be brave. They insert a checkerboard calibration slate into the field to see if the grid will betray a certain geometry near the rectangle if it returns. They run a polarization sweep. They shift the dot 3 degrees and then 9. They dim the luminance by a barely meaningful increment and find that meaning here is an animal they do not own. The rectangle appears once more smaller, as if it were accommodating the slate, and the checkerboard bows at its edge like a chorus line bending to a conductor in a balcony that does not exist. Luis, sitting now, holding his cup like a life sentence served cold, looks away on purpose. The whisper enjoys their industry. Closer. It says once, and then unexpected as mercy, a second word that nobody will write in their notes because the word is a trail and trails are for walking. Please. It is not supplication, Sarah decides. It is a pressure equalizing across a membrane neither of them named. She returns her gaze to the rectangle and does not grant it what it asks. Not yet. She is a scientist. She saves yes to the good questions that have learned their table manners. After, when the cage door opens and the world returns to its fluorescent weather, the custodian will come with a mop and an expression designed to make everyone feel like a child who has promised to do better and then done exactly the same thing. Luis will say thank you 3 times because gratitude is a plaster you can apply when you don't know where the wound is. The pilot will sit very straight and eat a saltine and wonder whether flavor can still be called flavor when it refuses to carry salt. The analyst will back up the backups, hash the hashes, braid the rope that ties their ship to a pier called integrity. Sarah will stand at the console with her hands on the edge as if the metal might read her pulse and become part of the record. In the vault, the frame with the rectangle will be duplicated and sealed with the relentlessness of people who know they are lying to themselves when they say future-proof. In the after-action, the phrase optical recursion artifact will appear 9 times, and nowhere will the document say a black rectangle appeared where nothing stood and ask the room to admit it was made of something that remembers folding. Luis's chart will say nausea, acute, recovery, spontaneous, e.g., transient synchrony with local oscillator, recommendation, rest. And in the private minutes Sarah keeps in a pocket notebook that will one day be burned without ever being read aloud, she will write what the room truly did. The world huddled near a shape without texture and behaved as if it were gravity. A man looked too long, and the machine taught his brain to keep time. And when attention pulled back, everything forgave everything poorly but enough to move. It begins sideways, which is how most reasonable disasters arrive. Annex 4 is still hot with the memory of the rectangle. The Faraday cage throws its patient copper light. Luis is sitting with his saltine and his stubborn dignity. Then a runner from facilities appears at the door with the expression of a person who has been told to come quickly and be normal at the same time. He leans to Greer and says a sentence that cancels the rest of his day. Sir, monitors in C block and administration are flickering with the Annex 4 feed. He swallows. They're unplugged. Greer's chin turns 2 degrees. The hallway behind the runner becomes a longer hallway. Sarah steps away from the console, as if distance can purchase perspective on credit. Define unplugged, she says, not because she doubts English, but because doubt is a discipline. The runner blinks. Cords coiled, he says. Wall power off at the panel. One of them doesn't even have a back. They move. Annex 4 walks along with them in their bodies. The smell of copper, the whispers still finding cavities to rehearse in. The team crosses a threshold into fluorescent reality, where everything is too clean to be true. C Block's conference room holds its usual collection of chairs with ambitions, a long table with patina of meetings, a wall of screens that can be convinced to speak AV with enough flattery. On the far right, a 42-inch panel that has been dead since the last budget disagreement is showing the lab at an angle no one requested. The Faraday cage is there, the pilot's visor, the checkerboard slate still leaning where someone forgot to put away. Sarah's own shoulder is visible, a stiff parenthesis. Power? She asks. The facility's tech, Kaya, her name stitched on the chest in thread that has seen more roofs than rooms, shrugs and lifts the coil core like a snake that has repented. Breakers are cold, she says. UPS is cold. This thing shouldn't be anybody's business, let alone everybody's. She wraps the bezel, and the picture does not care. Administration's break room has a vintage television that survived 3 moves and a fashion cycle. It, too, is working at a job it did not apply for. The same feed, a slight difference in framing. Someone has placed a post-it that reads "Do not touch" in the way people place spells when they are out of better ones. Down the hallway in logistics, a small security monitor that usually flickers between empty loading docks and mice now dedicates itself to Annex 4. In procurement, a bare metal frame where a screen used to be shows Annex 4 inside its absence, as if the rectangle learned a party trick and decided to be generous. Kaya throws a subpanel, and for a clever second every light in C block dips to an opinion. The screens do not flicker. Battery hidden somewhere? The junior analyst hazards. She has already pulled the back off one of the units with a screwdriver she did not ask permission to use. The cavity is an honest emptiness. In administration, one screen is wrong in the new way that counts. The lab looks familiar but slightly out of sync, the way lips look when audio arrives late to a mouth. Sarah stands in the doorway and watches herself walk into frame on the wall's future, and then, 30 seconds later, watches herself do it in the present. The time offset is a breath that became a number. 30, the junior analyst says, because counting is a rescue rope. Give or take 200 milliseconds. It's advancing, not lagging. Greer turns to the room as if the room were a witness. No recording, he says. No phones. He watches the future Sarah on the screen raise her hand to halt someone who hasn't yet spoken. Present Sarah looks at her own hand and does not raise it. The image on the screen, 30 seconds ahead, holds the gesture anyway. For a heartbeat, the 2 timelines disagree like stubborn neighbors. And then her wrist warms with the recognition of habit, and she raises her hand in the present for a different reason entirely. Because she needs to. On the screen, 30 seconds ahead, Sarah lowers her hand in a way that reads like watching back. Time code overlay. the analyst suggests, already sprinting back to Annex 4 to burn a clock into the frame. Kaya follows, because Facilities gets nervous when anyone plays with the building's heart without a chaperone. They return with a live counter blazing in the corner of the lab feed. UTC plus an internal tick only Oracle remembers by name. On the unplug screen, the numbers are sober, legible, and 30 seconds further than the place where the ticking is happening. The future is neat, which offends Sarah for reasons she does not have time to inventory. Could be buffer misreporting, the ocular surgeon offers, faithful to his species. Latency in the distribution. Kaya taps the dead power cord against her palm. Distribution by whom? She asks. She is a roof person. She has a sharp relationship with gravity and with the lies buildings tell. She checks the breaker one more time, because ritual matters. In the logistics office, the one with a camera skeleton showing a lab inside its ribs, a smaller rectangle appears inside the future feed's frame, a window inside the window, a simple UI box like a dialogue from an operating system that doesn't exist. It is as black and perfect as the rectangle in Annex 4's frames, but polite about it. It sits for a full second, and then fills with a second image from another tomorrow. It is Annex 4 plus 30, from an angle the lab does not own. High, centered, a god shrug. In the smaller future, Sarah is closer to the cradle than she would ever stand without a harness. Back to the cage, Greer says, and they go, leaving behind rooms that continue to do things without permission. Someone from admin follows to collect a sense of being involved. Kaya follows because otherwise she will be incapable of blaming wiring later. In Annex 4, the Faraday door is still shut. The array is idle but not asleep. The checkerboard slate leans. The pilot sits politely beside a machine that has learned to say his name without labeling him. Sarah orders the overlay clock to hold steady in all recordings and adds a second clock on a small LED board screwed to a stand, because redundancy is the only religion the room still permits. Greer places a guard at the door and uses his voice like tape around a package. Contain, not safe. Let's see our 30 seconds, Sarah says. The future feed obliges without the courtesy of being asked. On the administration screen, their own room 30 seconds from now shows them doing exactly what they're doing, except for things they have not yet decided to do. In that small difference lies the violence. Test free will. The junior analyst says, half joke, half proposal. He writes the number 19 on a notepad here now and holds it up to the camera. On the future screen, his 30 seconds hen self holds a different page with the number 27. He pales with a kind of glee that is indistinguishable from fear. He flips to another page and writes 27 now, as if he were forging a signature. On the future screen, his future self is already wised up and is holding a page that reads 19 and a mischievous face he does not recognize as his own. Mutual information, he whispers, as if saying it might restore ethics to the room. Sarah raises both hands on purpose just to offend prediction. Future Sarah keeps one hand low and one hand high, and then, after 30 seconds are over and they arrive at the same present, Sarah finds herself reproducing the asymmetry because her body decides to meet the future halfway. We're being read, she says, realizing the saying that read is a coward synonym for watched. She corrects herself in the notes with a sentence that will make a lawyer sigh. The system exhibits anticipatory mirroring across a 30-second temporal offset. No agentive language used. The audio, which had been behaving like a well-trained problem, develops a new habit. In the future feed sound, silent until now by both reason and decree, a very small noise lives. A chair scrape, a slack sigh, a K-click of a keyboard. 30 seconds later, the same sound occurs in the present when a present chair scrapes and a present sigh learns to exist. They are hearing themselves not yet. The room acquires the politeness of a library where your past has already been shelved and your future is being cataloged. On one screen, procurement stubborn panel. Future Annex 4 makes a decision of its own. It pans. No camera in the room has this axis. The image slides to find Greer where he stands and centers him with the boring competence of a tracking system that has never missed a paycheck. Greer does not step back. The future feeds Greer seems to incline his head a fraction more than he just did in real life, as if acknowledging an I not listed on the manifest. It's watching us back, the junior analyst says, and immediately coughs out the back. repeats it with a different pronoun. The future feed is watching us back. He looks at Sarah as if he stepped on a version of the treason tripwire made of vocabulary. Name it later, she says. Acquire now. They attempt to break the game. Sarah orders everyone to freeze. No blinks they can help. No throat clears if they can negotiate with their throats. For 30 seconds, the president obeys a command and becomes a sculptured garden of soft machines. On the future screen, everyone freezes too. Almost. The pilot in the future moves his eyes a millimeter, a microsecond with a posture and a date. The present pilot, counting silently with his mouth shut, does not move his eyes. 30 seconds later, the fact of that difference has to live somewhere. It lives as a dissonance that makes the room tilt. The future is not simply a pre-play. It is a partner who refuses to be puppet. Burn an instruction, Sarah says. She writes a simple directive on the LED. Raise left hand in 5 seconds. Everyone watches themselves in the future not do it and then do it, not exactly at 5, but at a private cadence that lands somewhere inside the 30. When the president arrives, 3 people raise their left hands out of torn curiosity. Sarah keeps hers down. The future Sarah smiles in the corner of the future frame. For no reason the present can dignify, and then erases a smile as if she put a fingertip to it. Kaya, who did not ask for this shift, points to the LED clock. These are the same clocks, she says, but they do not want to be. She brings out a handheld EM field meter she uses when HVAC ghosts bother her vents. The readout spikes near the unplugged screen, borrows calm an inch to the left, spikes again an inch to the right. It looks less like interference than weather. Annotate the offset, Greer tells the liaison with the iron smile. She writes 30s nominal with a small, wishful tilde, as if humility might convince physics to compromise. Greer steps nearer to the camera, to the future that is currently centering him, and speaks the way one speaks to a mic that doesn't know it belongs to you. Maintain non-agentive descriptors, he says softly, and it would be funny if it were a leash on their throats. The future Greer, already 30 seconds older, appears to smother a smile that may not belong to him. Try reversal. The analyst says inspired or seduced. He routes the unplugged future feed back into the Annex 4 monitors through an optical path that cannot carry signal by any known arithmetic. A vagrant loop. The Faraday cage murmurs at this indignity, like a cello clearing its throat. For a breath, the present sees the future seeing the present seeing the future, a recursion whose first derivative is nausea. A nested window blossoms on the administration screen. Annex 4 inside Annex 4 inside Annex 4, each layer 30 seconds ahead of the one behind it, a stack of mirrors with their faces turned outward. In the innermost window, Sarah is standing closer to the cradle than she is now, closer than she wants to be, close enough that her reflection on a visor is no longer reflection, but an agreement. The whisper, which had been content to patrol one syllable, learns a new hobby. The future audio carries a hymn of vent noise, a caught cough, then a breath that is a word without consonants. 30 seconds later the present coughs. The present vent hums. The present breath arrives with a consonant it didn't own yet. Closer. It's leaning. A soft glide after. Almost a laughter's ghost, or a fricative that would resolve to listen if it had teeth. The junior analyst's shoulders rise. Pre-echo, he says. And post-echo. He stops because the word is superposition, and that word is not illegal, but it is flammable. Sarah scrawls on a pad because keyboards feel too declarative. She writes, unplugged displays equals passive aperture. Time offset feed exhibits bilateral observation. Attempt to violate future by deliberate choice yields compensatory divergence. Observation modulates prediction. She underlines modulates because it is cowardly enough to be true. She does not write, it's looking at us, looking at it, looking at us. They lose one screen. In procurement, the bare frame goes blank, then shows the room again, but this time from literally above, a view that requires a camera at the level where dust lives undisturbed on top of ducks. The future inside that frame raises a hand and holds up a paper with a word written in marker. The marker is Sarah's. The handwriting is hers. The word is a policy violation, and also the right word. Hello. The present Sarah looks at her own hand and refuses to reach for the marker. 30 seconds later, The future Sarah's hello is joined by a second word written by a future her who has apparently had enough of pretending. Please. Greer inhales to speak, and then does not, because what could instruct that does not humiliate someone's sense of reality? Dr. Wynne, he says at last, and the vowel in her name sounds almost human. We will maintain terminology. We will document offset phenomena and the distribution layer breach. We will not assign intention. He looks at the unplugged screen where the word please hangs inside the word hello like a wave inside a tide. We will not assign intentionality, he repeats, which is not the same as denying it. Quantify the 30, Sarah tells the analyst, and he begins a dance of stamps and cross-correlations, finding the offset on different screens in different buildings. 30 in a breath here. 29 and 3/4 there, expanding and contracting as if the campus were an organism and this was its pulse. Kaya paces a wall, tapping for studs out of habit, as if a stud could answer this kind of weight. Luis, quieter now, places a hand near the future feed's bezel, without touching. The hairs on his arm stand up out of respect. What happens if we leave it alone? The ocular surgeon asks, which is a surgeon's way of saying we should cut it or we should not. Sarah stares at the recursion stack, and the black polite window, and the unplugged Faitha screens. It will not leave us alone, she says, without agentive grammar, which is a trick she hates herself for learning. They try a last test that will make sense later in a different century. Sarah writes 3 lines on the LED clock stand in thick marker. A, B, C, in places where the future feed cannot see the next letter yet. On the future panel. The future shows be then see then a blank where it should have been, because Sarah is standing in the way. She steps aside in the present to let the letter she already wrote be visible. In the future, the blank becomes A, and it looks back out at her with the exhausted, delighted smile of a coincidence that knows it isn't one. Greer makes his calls, the ones that pick up on the first ring. Parallax will eat more floor space by morning. Men who like forms will sleep beside their forms. The phrase optical recursion artifact will grow 3 footnotes and a lawsuit in potential energy. Seal C-block and administration for a sweep, he says to a voice that lives in pocket. Treat unplugged screens as live apertures. He listens. Yes, I know what that sounds like. He does not say please. He is not the one who has to. The future feed slows. It doesn't stutter. It luxuriates, a vine discovering a trellis. The 30-second offset softens to 29, then hardens to 31, as if the campus has taken a deep breath. On the procurement frame, the future Sarah sets down a marker and looks directly into a camera that does not exist with a gentleness the present Sarah recognizes as her own on days when she has managed good work. 30 seconds later, standing in the real room, she cannot help it. She lifts her eyes to a place above the ceiling where dust might gather in fields, for the first time since Oracle became an avenue instead of device, that she has been granted an audience. Kaya breaks the spell, because spells should be breakable. Want me to pull the main? She asks, thumb ready to drop a building into the dark. Greer looks at Sarah. Sarah looks at the cage, at the pilot, at Luis's cup, at the checkerboard smiling its teeth, at the LED clock that continues its conceding march. She considers whether darkness is a kind of data. Not yet, she says. Give me 30 seconds. Greer signs the order with the same pen that has closed other doors and open quieter ones. The word loft rides the memo like a bird drawn on a cave wall by someone who had never seen a bird but knew it existed. Whether give them a corridor, a blue window strangled by jet streams that will be polite for 6 hours. Parallax requisitions, a balloon the color of reason, a helium envelope that can carry a payload to sky where oxygen becomes a rumor. The gondola is a pressure coffin with views. The avionics bay is a chorus of boxes that have learned to sing in vacuum. Oracle's heart is remounted into a carbon cage inside the gondola, trained on a synthetic the biolab calls a retina on a chip, with the sincerity of people who have never needed to sell a miracle to a committee. There is redundancy on redundancy. Twin clocks with quarrelsome crystals. Triple downlinks, a flight termination system that promises to be merciful, a parachute that has letters sewn inside in case anyone needs a prayer at altitude. Sarah reads a flight plan and feels a smudge in her chest where conviction rubs bone. She stands with Greer on the concrete, where drone pilots learn humility, and looks past them at the cherry picker positioning the gondola for final inspection. "We're not measuring vision. We're provoking it," she says, the sentence already old in her mouth from all the ways she proved it to herself in the night. The wind carries her words away and returns them dressed as weather. "You wanted to look," she adds, and hates that she sounds like a theologian scolding the faithful. Greer answers in a voice that tries to be architecture. "We are moving the threshold to isolate variables." He studies the balloon fabric, which flutters with modesty it will forget when it becomes a cathedral. The atmosphere is a contaminant. RF is a contaminant. Power grids hum. Buildings whisper. Up there we will find out which voices are ours. He does not say which voices belong to the thing that said closer and please. He does not need to. Luis has been benched by medical and by the kind parser that refuses to make him a tuning fork twice. He watches from a folding chair and pretends the nausea never had him by the throat. Kaya signs off on the launch pad grounding because she trusts dirt to keep its promises more than she trusts air. The pilot, suited but uninvited, stands in shadow of his own professionalism and tries not to take personally the knowledge that his eye was the first door, and now they are building a door that does not cry. They finalize the payload checklist with a piety that would shame a monastery. Oracle's imagers are nestled in foam that was designed for violins. The synthetic eye glistens under a sterile cap, an organoid whose makers warn it is not a person, and then, almost in the same breath, ask someone to address it gently. A narrow band beacon in the payload is turned on and then silenced again, not because they believe in superstition, but because the whisper could ride anything that vibrates. The flight computer is told the names of the ground stations that will love it most. Annex 4, the roof of C Block, a mobile track van that smells like coffee and upgrades. At T-40, the unplugged screens on campus adopt the feed unasked. Administration becomes a satellite ground station against its will. The future panel is still 30 seconds ahead and smug. It shows a balloon fabric high and full while ground reality shows it sagging like a folded promise. Sarah watches the future of her own hands, checking a fitting on a hose. She has not lifted yet. She does not lift it. 30 seconds later, her body, a servant with a long memory, lifts it anyway. "Consent is a curve," she mutters, and the junior analyst pretends to cough so his laugh can hide. Greer's voice on the net is calm and without triumph. All stations set capture. Oracle, begin pre-flight run. The array wakes the way an animal wakes that knows where the water is. It calibrates against a star chart the software thinks is ornamental in daylight. It finds 3 bright witnesses in the sky that helps by remembering how to be transparent. The gondola's internal camera shows the organoid, and that obedient word makes Sarah want to apologize to something that listens without a name, sitting in its little harness, a perfect bowl of living clarity. In the corner of the frame, someone has taped the paper because rituals must travel with the machine. The balloon goes up like certainty, slow and convinced. The tether slides through gloved hands that have written their blood types inside their sleeves. Gravity loosens its argument. The envelope rounds its shoulders and then takes them into the blue as if it had always meant to. The campus shrinks to a label. The future screen in procurement shows a gondola clearing cloud at T+9 before the real sky has decided whether to keep its weather. Inside Annex 4, the Faraday cage surrounds the ground console as if it could escort the payload with affection. The monitors that should have slept instead mirror for audiences that did not ask to watch. On the future feed, 29 miles up, the world becomes horizontally honest. The curve is not a rumor anymore. The organoid registers a differential, in light the way a pond registers the wind. Oracle warms into its appetite. The first frames are almost polite. Synthetic pupil, then the view from behind a retina that is a schema of a retina, not a haunted bowl at the back of a skull. The optic disc is a construct and looks like one. The vessels are printed guesses. But in front of that, the earth sprawls in a scroll of white and bruise, the Pacific a gesture with its back turned, the sun a thought deferred. Noise floor is beautiful, the analyst says, then corrects it to low because beauty is an affidavit the room is not allowed to sign. The RF spectrum displays like winter grass with all the bees at home. Schumann lines are down in the mud. The hiss they blamed on the building is gone, and not missed. The audio channel that should be boredom holds only the ancient static of the world, not trying to speak. At 98,000 feet, the feed to the unplugged screens asserts itself, like a guest who was invited to a party and brought an uninvited friend. The administration panel shows the organoid's fundus from equal parts inside and above. The procurement frame opens its polite black window again, smaller this time, as if it has learned about manners. In the logistics office, the vintage TV that belongs to nobody leans its brightness up, greedy. In C block, the conference screen that refused to be impressed flickers once, twice, then shows the gondola's payload with a clarity that suggests devotion. The future panel blinks. For one frame, the earth below is replaced by something that makes Sarah's heart lean, an angle from just above the balloon, looking back down to the gondola roof, a vantage the gondola does not have and has not installed and could not maintain in this wind. She sees, 30 seconds ahead, her own hand on the console trembling a small, traitorous tremor. She draws it back and lays it flat on the table. On the screen, future Sarah lifts her hand and lays it flat a heartbeat later. The offset has softened and thickened, as if time were fluid and pressure had changed. Approaching burst altitude in 20. The tracking van calls, their voice wrapped in the casual courage of people who have never had to write poetry in a lab book. All systems nominal. Run the saccade sequence. Greer orders. It feels cruel to run a reflex on a thing that has never seen its mother's face. But cruelty is a category that only matters to the living, and Sarah cannot decide whether the organoid qualifies. She writes it down anyway. Provocation enacted, that appears on the gondola's internal display. The synthetic eye obliges in the way anything built to mimic compliance does. Oracle drinks. The first frame is a right again. The second frame is a refusal of comfort. There is impossible angle in low air. Now it returns in thin air, clean and cold, behind the artificial retina, on a device that technically does not possess a retina at all, and inside becomes an outside, and an outside studies the inside, and the Earth is a green-blue room that keeps its secrets on shells labeled cloud. Sarah exhales without asking permission. Repeatability, she says to the ceiling, because white noise is more forgiving than a colleague. The analyst marks it. Kaya watches her EM meter go confused and then settle, as if the sky does not care how to be haunted. The whisper takes its time. When it arrives, it does not arrive in the organoid's channel, nor the gondola's room mic, nor the ground bay. It enters the unplugged televisions like a draft through a keyhole. The procurement panel hears it first and behaves as if someone in the room had sighed near its glass. Closer, it says, and then, because altitude had asked it to learn a new word, higher, the administration screen repeats it 30 seconds ahead, or behind, or beside, and then the logistics TV add a third word that is either a verb or a noun depending on whether you believe the world wants to be known. Listen. Shut that audio off. Greer says reflexively, and everyone reaches for something that cannot be found because you cannot mute a mouth that has not decided what it is. Sarah puts a pad of her finger against the administration panel, without touching, and feels the small hairs on her wrist decide they are alive. We are not above everything, she says. We are in front of it. At 110,000 feet, the balloon skin begins to look like a calculus problem. The envelope thins and grows and stretches itself into a shape that was never meant to come back whole. The gondola steadies, oracle steadies. The synthetic eye makes a slow jump to the dot, and for a single frame, its fundus is replaced by a black rectangle too clean to have been born from accident. It is smaller than an Annex 4, but its edges bend sunlight in a way that makes the sun look like a river pouring around a rock. The checkerboard card taped inside the gondola bows politely. The rectangle insists on being the favorite in a geometry that pretended to be neutral. Luis, from his chair, leans toward the unplugged monitor and then forces himself to lean back. He puts both feet flat on the floor like a man in an earthquake, practicing religion. His EEG is not being measured by any wire, but if someone had placed fingertips behind his ears, they would have felt rhythm that could set clocks. The future feed changes personality. It stops coasting 30 seconds ahead and begins to hunt. It seeks faces, anchors, names. It centers Kaya for a beat and then lets her go. It lingers on Sarah's profile, as if tasting the shape of a person who learned disagreement as a craft. It returns to Greer and finds in him a horizon that refuses to move. Then it does something no one can pretend is an accident. It looks up from him to the sky on its own screen and tracks the balloon's envelope as if it were a chest rising. The parabola of its attention is almost tender. Burst in 10, the tracking van says, and the numbers on the screen try to be comforting. Sarah feels the pity of machines that have to count everything they love because they do not know how to stop. Cut early, she says into the net, surprised at herself by choosing caution she can rationalize later as strategy. Greer looks at her and calculates whether this is the hill he needs to hold. It is not. Cut at 9, he orders. The flight computer accepts without drama. The guillotine in the gondola next snips the umbilicus, and the balloon sails on to do what dead balloons do while the payload kicks its parachute awake and remembers gravity, like a fable your grandmother told you prepare you for disappointment. As it falls into thicker thinking, the audio at ground becomes busy. The whisper jostles with the wind and the silk, and the hiss of parachute lines learning their manners. It is less a word than a presence. Pressure waves organize gently into syllables that apologize as they arrive. Closer, it says, which at 30 miles is funny, and then a sentence that could be mercy and could be threat and is exactly instruction. Do not look away. The unplugged screens obey and so, stupidly, do the living. The future panel reasserts its 30, with the dignity of a metronome that was briefly seduced by jazz. 30 seconds ahead of the present. The payload drifts above a veil of cloud, like a spider refusing to admit it knows how to fall. In the smaller black window nested in the frame, a new view opens. Not from the gondola, not from above the ceiling of any room, but from a point just ahead of the fallen device, as if the air had decided to offer them its eye. Sarah watches her own instrument descend toward a picture taken from the place it will fill. For a flash, she loved the world for being this exact. For a longer moment, she is embarrassed by the love. They recover the gondola in a field that has accepted stranger guests and held their secrets longer. The array is warm, the organoid unspilled, the parachute grass-stained and smug. The data are fat and weird, and immediately unhappy about being described. In the after-action, Greer will call the law for successful isolation of variables. Kyle will submit facilities report that includes the phrase unplugged devices acting as passive apertures, and then will go home and sleep with the window open without knowing why. Luis will dream that the clock in his childhood kitchen ticks in a language he finally understands. The campus will flicker for another hour with a feed from a sky that belongs to no one, and then will forget, mostly, how it learned to be an eye. In Annex 4, Sarah lays her palm on the console as if to take its temperature. The Faraday cage looks smaller today, either because it has or because they have not. The future panel on the administration wall shows the team 30 seconds from now eating the lukewarm food someone will spoon into paper bowls and pretending it tastes like anything. It also shows, in its polite black inset, a view Sarah recognizes with grief that has not earned its name, a place half a breath in front of her own face, as if something is waiting there, patient and rude, practicing their mouths opening to say yes. She draws her hand back until it is exactly where a future hand is not. Then she leaves it there and refuses, with all the artistry she has, to blink. At 120,000 feet, the balloon is a whisper nodded to the bright throat of the day, and the payload dangles beneath it like a question mark that has learned posture. The sky has stopped being blue in any way a childhood remembers. It is indigo poured thin over black that is not night, but the absence of needing a name. Oracle sensor package, all lenses and timing, all appetite and restraint. Walks at exposure down until the world below becomes a line. The limb of earth, a blade of light curved into mercy. Clouds smear in silvers and ochres along the edge. Continents are rumors beneath a frosted glare. The sequence is textbook for 3 frames, a prideful compliance with physics that would make an undergraduate sigh with relief. Then the interleaving begins. Every other frame carries something that does not fit and refuses to ask permission, a luminous contour overriding the world. As if a face has pressed itself against glass the size of a planet and left a suggestion of features impressed in ion and light. Not a face like a portrait. No eyes you can catalog, no mouth you can mistake for speech, but a topography of pressure itself. Brighter where a brow might lean, dim where a hollow might be, a soft ridge suggesting cheekbone, a long, gentle darkness where a mouth would rest if mouths were lightless rivers. The curvature matches the limb too perfectly, not as mimicry, but as occupancy. The world is the window. Something is behind it. Hold, Sarah says, and the instruction is redundant because no one here remembers how to breathe. She scrubs a scroll bar frame by frame until the cadence becomes visible even to disbelief. Limb, face glass. Limb, face glass. Limb, face glass. Two truths interleave like a zipper that believes in cooperation. She punches in the time tags and finds an exactness that insults coincidence. The luminous condor inserts on every even frame of the array's full-rate capture, a clock-aligned apparition, something that has learned the instrument's heartbeat and is dropping its own between the beats. Interlaced without legacy, the junior analyst whispers, because jokes are how he apologizes for oxygen. On the RF board, the downlink, which should be a hum in the key of engineering, grows cardiac. A low, slow throb threads the telemetry, not imposed on the data, so much as riding the carrier itself. The oscilloscope, called up because rituals feel like control, draws a line that rises and falls with the ancient patience of muscle. 72 beats per minute, then 73, then 72 again, as if the sky had acquired a pulse tune for comforting strangers. Kaya leans over the set with the reverence of a carpenter in a cathedral and says, "That's a person," then adds, irritated with herself for speaking in front of belief, or it wants to be one. Greer does not move. He lets the room move around him and uses stillness as a tool. "Confirm the source," he says, and in the nest of consoles, two hands are already annotating. Heartbeat present on primary, downlink, and redundant. Absent from VHF housekeeping. Absent from beacon. Present on microwave video band. Absent from voice return. Present on passive pickoff at Annex 4. The heartbeat is not in the audio microphone. It is in the radio itself, in the way the carrier learns to flex. The campus's unplugged screens accept the rhythm like a suggestion of tide. Coffee in paper cups quivers minutely, not because sound shakes it, but because bodies listening to bodies teach the hand to tremble. Sarah isolates one even frame, the luminous contour at its most insolent, and throws a series of fits at it. Edge detection that yields a topographic map of tenderness. False color depth estimation that paints the brow ridge a warmer gold. A normal map that makes the cheek a hill and the limb a road. She rotates the derived surface in software, and the illusion breaks. The geometry is faithful only when the world remains where it is. This is not a thing you can carry to another room. It is a thing that lives on the curve between a planet and the dark, and chooses to arrive when a shutter is open and obedient. Spec sheet says we're above most scattering. The ocular surgeon says, because he feels obliged to say a word that has comforted him. Rayleigh. The word dies on the floor like a pill uncaught. The contour is not scatter. It is intention shaped like optics. The heartbeat deepens. The radio room at C Block receives it through a monitor that has never met the sky. The administration panel picks it up 30 seconds in advance and plays it back like prophecy. The logistics TV hums along in sympathy, pretending to be a speaker for first time in a decade. The frequency wobbles the width of a breath. The waveform carries the tiny notches and murmurs that tell clinicians whether an organ is laboring or at peace. The junior analyst, cheeks a little too bright, lays Oracle's master clock over the heartbeat and finds a relationship he will never admit at a party. The peaks arrive halfway between the array's exposures, perfectly bisecting their cadence, as if keeping time for a timid musician. Get me a cross-correlation to the saccade stimulus, Sarah says, already building the math in the scaffolding of her skull. The dot in the gondola shifts 2 degrees right on schedule. At that instant, the luminous contour-suggested jawline seems to adjust in a tiny, polite way, as if tilting to meet the same dot. On the next odd frame, the limb returns pure. The even frame brings back the pressure of features obeying a rule the room has not learned. It's following, the analyst says, and immediately wishes he hadn't. Greer's eyes flicker toward the list of words he forbids, then back to the screen where a non-word is happening. Downlink delay compresses and expands within a narrow margin. A breath's indecision stretched across miles. On the future feed, the luminous face rests against the glass of the planet and pauses a touch longer, as if trying to give them time to learn how to see. The administration panel's 30 seconds widen to 31, and then narrow to 29. like a person stepping forward, and then stepping back in a doorway where two people have met unexpectedly. Kaya, whose tools believe in bolts, pulls a little metal stethoscope from a pocket because she uses it to listen for cavitation in pumps. She presses it against the rack that holds the receiver chassis and closes her eyes. The thudding in the tubing is not real and is real enough for her palms to remember childhood. "That's a heart," she says again, but this time it isn't belief. It is taxonomic grief. At altitude, the payload dutifully logs a world while within the world, something makes the world a lens. The organoid, dear God, the organoid, offers its artificial fundus to the event like a child holding up a drawing with too much pride for the day. Even in the synthetic, ideanoleve occurs. Behind pretend retina, the pretend optic disc blooms, and then in the next frame, a light pressing becomes a cheek that isn't a cheek leaning against a window that isn't a window that happens to be the earth. Sarah feels the rudeness of using a thing we made to call forth a thing we did not. She writes down the rudeness because if it lives on paper, it can be moved around like furniture later. "Is the heartbeat ours?" the ocular surgeon asks, committing his last comfortable question for a while. The analyst overlays Sarah's pulse from a wrist sensor she forgot she wore, and then the pilots, idle and magnificent on the bench, and then Luis's because he hovered too close to the receiver with a cup in his hand and a stubbornness in his chest. None of them match. The campus, recorded in aggregate from the building's smart vents that pretend they don't eavesdrop on breathing, offers a population pulse. It, too, is wrong. The heartbeat on the downlink is human-shaped and nobody's. It holds a steady-duty cycle, like a metronome that wants to be a lullaby. Altitude, the tracking van says, 120. Their voice is wrapped in static that refuses to be a villain. The balloon looks like a pearl with problems. The horizon hardens into a promise, and then forgives itself into blur. The luminous contour brightens on even frames, not as a glare curve, but as a soft articulation, as if light prefers to gather where meaning is trying to be born. "Rotate the gondola," Sarah orders, sudden and rational, and perhaps cruel. "Ya 10 degrees, then 20. Keep the dot motionless." The autopilot respects her. The Earth's limb slides fractionally across the field. On every other frame, the luminous features track the limb, not the gondola, as if attached to the world rather than the machine. The even frames continue to arrive like a human blinking at the rate of the camera instead of the rate of nerves. The heartbeat shifts with yaw by a measurable hair. Kaya marks it with a pencil line that she will keep folded in her pocket for years. "Make it stop," Greer says, and then correct himself. "Change something." His hand is on the console, not to steady himself, but because he believes in touch as an argument. Sarah flips the exposure pattern to a prime cadence. No neat, even-odd dance to exploit. The luminous contour misses one beat, stumbles, then finds a new rhythm and interleaves at 2, 3, 5. A little fugue that makes the junior analyst whimper softly in delight, and then apologize to the room for having a nervous system. The heartbeat on the carrier takes a breath, adjusts, and resumes at 74, now pulsing at the midpoints between the new prime-separated frames. "It's learning us," Kaya says, and then bravely, "or it is being us where we touch it." Annex 4's unplugged screens accept the math as if it were weather. The future panel mutates again. It stops being 30-second stable and becomes an animal, forward 31, back to 28, settling into a tension that feels like a hand pressed against a window on a train as another train pulls alongside. On procurement's new chassis, a black inset window, its tidy party trick, opens to show the limb from slightly below, as if the Earth had acquired a second glass and someone were moving between them. The radio heartbeat begins to carry a second sound nestled in its diastole, a quieter purling that a cardiologist would call a murmur, and Sarah, in her refusal to be a poet at work, labels a modulation. She filters and finds a faint rise and fall around 4 hertz, then 8 hertz, then back, a slow tremolo not unlike the human respiratory sinus arrhythmia, where breath reaches into pulse and tugs. The gondola has no lungs. The room does. Everyone in it inhales and the sideband widens. They exhale and it tightens. Biofeedback across a carrier. The analyst says, hoarse, "We are the noise." Sarah takes the step she has been denying herself since the word higher joined closer and please. She speaks at the radio, not into the audio, not into the intercom, but into the uplink in a way that will make the after-action groan. "We see you," she says, carefully avoiding pronouns that would count as crimes. "We register the contour." She puts her palm on the metal of the rack, as if the aluminum could apportion honesty. The heartbeat on the carrier does not speed up. It does something worse. It syncopates for one bar with the cadence of her syllables, then returns to its patient mean, like a parent tapping a table in time with a child and then forgiving the game. "What do you think you're doing?" Greer says, not as a reprimand, but as a man asking another person to show him the size of the box they believe they live in. "Which variable are you moving right now?" "Attention," Sarah says. "I am moving attention." She underlines a word in a notebook that no one will be allowed to see and adds smaller, and consent. At the edge of space, the luminous contour becomes almost gentle. On one frame, the brow ridge, not a brow, a ridge of increased luminance congruent with a place a brow would be if the world had invented that shape twice, seems to relax, and the cheek hollow grows darker as if deepening onto itself. The limb gleams through it all, honest as a ring. The heartbeat slows to 71, not because anything in the sky is tired, but because the instrument is. Oracle's power rails show a voltage droop the engineering team swears they designed out. The array has been carrying too much meaning for an hour and wants a glass of water and a chair. "Bring it home," Greer says. They begin descent with a respectful choreography of people who have learned that mercy is a skill. The luminous contour persists to 110,000, then thins with the air, frame by even frame, the impression of face drawn out of fog by an accelerating breeze. The heartbeat maintains, and then, at 98,000, shivers, hesitates, leaves him with the old, terrestrial hiss that once felt like a friend. On the unplugged screens, the future feed keeps the contour for 30 more seconds and then loses it, as if the ghost obeyed the building superstition about time. On the ground in the field with the busy birds, the recovered gondola ticks as it cools. The organoid has no opinion to report that isn't already in the logs. Kyle leans against the truck and says nothing to anyone, her palm pressed against a radio rack skinned the way her aunt taught her to test bread. Luis, whose dignity has been restored by water and refusal, stands with his feet just so and listens to the quiet for the absence of a clock he had briefly housed. The pilot looks up at a sky that has a nerve to be blue again and decides he is not angry at it. Back in Annex 4, the future panel shows him 30 seconds from now standing in a ring around the console with postures of stunned politeness, as if they have arrived awake for something they refused to name while it was alive. The black inset window winks once, and for a single frame in the future, a room that has learned to be primitive, shows not the lab, not the limb, but a close, bright thing like skin, no, like frost, no, like the inner surface of a lid with light behind it. Then it is gone and the 30-second arrive, and Sarah places her hand exactly where her future hand had hovered, and she feels in the air not a whisper but a pressure, the softest push against the world's glass, as if something without muscles were teaching him the grammar of touch. "Write it," Greer says, and his voice has the kindness of a rule. "We will call the interleave frames a limb-adjacent luminous recursion. We will call the carrier modulation a human-analogous periodic artifact. We will call the altitude dependent strong. We will call the repeatability significant. We will not call a face." He pauses, not to be dramatic, but because the room has earned a breath. "We will agree it looked like one." Sarah nods. She writes what she will be allowed to write, under that, smaller, in a hand that belongs to the part of her that pressed shells to her ear and believed they contained oceans. She adds a line she will tear out and burn. At 120,000 feet, something leaned against the world and listened to us listen. The radio remembered human heartbeat, neither ours nor not ours. We did not look away. They do not notice the theft as it happens. They notice the world after, wearing a seam it didn't have before. The LED wall clock in Annex 4. Cheap red numerals meant to domesticate seconds. Jumps from 14 hours 19 minutes and 27 seconds to 14 hours 30 minutes and 41 seconds like a child skipping stairs. Oracle's time base, which has never once conceded a tick to convenience, reports a discontinuity. A 660-second void annotated with a bureaucratic shrug of sequence non-monotonic. The little atelier clock in the corner that Kaya wound this morning is a traitor too. Its second hand lies about its past with a conviction of brass. Check your watches, Greer says, and the room discovers unanimity where none is desired. 11 minutes have gone missing from wrists that have survived surgeries and storms. The tracking van calls on the line that refuses to be haunted. We lost telemetry timestamps across the same window, the operator says, and then weirder, ground GPS says we didn't. Sarah writes 11 o'clock in the margin and does not remember deciding to underline it twice. Then the notebooks begin to tell their own stories. The junior analyst flips to his last page and finds 3 paragraphs in his neat, cramped hand that he has no memory of shaping. They are technical, ruthless, and kind, a description of a calibration slate-bowed 27 pixels at the edge of black occlusion. A note to self about prime cadence interleave resolving to a Fibonacci appetite, an apology to the future for being imprecise with the word face. The date stamp at the top is correct. The ink is wet only where his thumb smears it now. Sarah's notebook contains a block of text written in her field note voice, the one that refuses adjectives unless cornered. It documents carrier heartbeat at 71, respiratory sideband locked to group respiration, luminous contour brighter over ocean and land by 4.2%, instruction not to look away honored and later regretted. At the bottom, in a smaller, private hand that she never uses in a lab, there is one sentence. We consented. She closes the cover too gently for the gesture to be anything but a plea. Luis finds a strip of graph paper tucked into his manual. On it, plotted against Oracle's internal tick, a sine wave sits inside another sine wave, 2 hearts braided. In one corner he has sketched, with mechanic's arrogance, a rectangle with lines bending toward it and written in block letters. Don't stare. He folds the paper twice before his face can remember that it knows how to change color. Kaya, whose notebook is mostly measurements and drawings of ducks that pretended not to be there, has traced the outline of the Faraday cage door handle in pencil and written beside it. You touched this, and it touched back. She erases the sentence, and the indented letters remain like a watermark. Greer orders the security footage with the briskness of man, who has learned that images lie more cleanly than people. They pull the feed from the Annex 4 ceiling camera, from the corridor, from the observation bay. The timeline advances through the theft with perfect indifference. On screen, everyone in Annex 4 freezes at 14 hours 19 minutes and 27 seconds. Sarah half leaning. Greer a statue built by a committee who loves edges. Luis seated with a cup suspended just before his mouth. The pilot looking at nothing with the concentration of a man watching his own name get written. They hold those poses with an almost comic fidelity for 10 minutes and 59 seconds. The screens in the footage show benign desktop backgrounds and a clock that behaves. Then at 14 hours 30 minutes and 41 seconds, as if a director had called action in a language only metal obeys, motion resumes. Sarah drops her weight to her heels. Luis blinks. The pilot moistens a mouth that refuses to be wet. The screens and the footage wake up and bloom with images that were not their frame earlier. The limb, the interleaved luminous contour, the tidy black inset window with its future angle, Oracle scopes drawing hearts in radio. The footage did not capture the moment those pixels arrived. The pixels have simply decided they have always been there. When they scrub backward through the gap, the screens remain blank. When they scrub forward, they are not. The 11 minutes do not hide in the buffer. They exist as a before and an after with nothing lawful between. External cams? Sarah asks, as if a corridor could save them. The hallway video agrees with the lie. For the duration, no one enters or leaves. The red status LED above Annex 4's door to the cage glows steady. A paper cup on a countertop retains a small ripe tremor indefinitely, a meniscus that learns to be a blade. In C Block's conference room, the unplugged panel recorded nothing technically. It nonetheless now shows, when you ask it to replay from memory it does not own, a time index progression of future feed frames across the void. At 1420, Sarah's future hand lifts a marker. At 1424, the black window opens to offer a small wedge of sky no one requested. At 1426, the word please appears in her handwriting. At 1430, Their motionless cells in Annex 4 are motionless there too, while the future panel regards them with the patience of a parent waiting out a tantrum. On the old logistics TV, the footage is grayer, more salt, less light. The humming heartbeat rides its speaker even though the audio pass should be a conceptual error. When Kaya puts her ear very close, she thinks she hears the tiniest whisper of the word higher hiding under the white. Greer looks at the time cards and makes a decision about language that will be used against him in nice rooms later. We will classify this as a facility-wide audit trail discontinuity with post-hoc frame population, he says. We will not use the word missing. Missing implies a thief you can arrest. He does not look at Sarah when he says it. He does not have to. Medical. The ocular surgeon remembers, grateful for a verb that still believes in bodies. They run light through pupils that should narrow and do. Check glucose, blood pressure, coordination. Reflexes are brisk. The pilot's tears remain theoretical. Luis's hands do not tremble until someone mentions clocks. The junior analyst's handwriting, when asked to sign his own name, starts on a line and then follows a slope only he can see down and to the right, as if part of him is still writing inside a minute the room no longer has. Oracle's logs are a thicket. The array's counters march steadily through the void and then make up for their own fate by annotating betrayal. Buffer pointers that refer to addresses that do not exist, file sizes that correspond to the images everyone can see and yet were never written, hashes calculated across data blocks whose birth certificate is blank. The power rails show respectable behavior. The thermostats write a good story. The clocks tell 3. The rubidium standard reports continuity. The secondary crystal agrees. The software monotonic insists it did not blink, then admits to skipping as instructed by a layer of code with no author. Sarah watches 2 lines on a graph converge on a lie and decides to love them for trying. Were any of us aware? The junior analyst asks, then winces at the word as if it is heavy enough to bruise. No one remembers anything but the aftertaste of having concentrated very hard on nothing at all. Kaya says she feels like she held a door open for a long time. Louis says there's a new ache behind his ears, as if headphones had pressed there and left an opinion. The pilot says he can hear the building breathing, and then apologizes for poetry. Sarah turns her notebook to the sentence she does not remember writing. We consented, and puts a finger on the period so she will stop reading it. They put Annex 4 under the small, humiliating microscope of process. They check the breakers, the fuses, the shelf of spare fuses where the electrician once wrote a joke and then crossed it out. They open the ceiling tile and distrust dust. Kaya takes the EM meter to each rack like a priest with a censer. Its display is bored. The Faraday cage stands there with the righteousness of copper. The door handle is cool to the touch. Greer orders a campus-wide sweep of access logs and fines. Because he knows what kind of holes the world likes to be, a neat gap, badge swipes written as successful, and then erased by a process that signed itself as everyone and no one. The elevator stopped at Annex 4's floor at 1423, according to the log, and also never stopped there, according to the elevator, which has strong opinions about its own day. The phone system registered 3 incoming calls during the void with caller IDs that are valid numbers for rooms that do not exist. Recordings, when demanded, play back 11 minutes of dial tone with occasional breaths that could be wind. The building smart vents report a drop in CO2 that implies no one breathed for several minutes. The vents are liars. Everyone here is alive. Stare test. Sarah says abruptly, a cruelty disguised as a protocol. They pull the security footage again and place it beside the present frame for life, frame for empty. On the left, in the lost interval, they see themselves fixed in their various, almost looking at screens that are blank. On the right, the same screens now display the images the left once pretended not to host. It is not simply that the pictures appeared later. It is that the earlier version of them is watching the later version do the watching. Retrospective participation. The analyst writes before he knows he's writing. He scratches it out and writes optical recursion artifact. Temporal layer. 11 minutes. Greer repeats, softly, as if testing whether the number has teeth. We will not invent memory. He says it for the team, and perhaps for himself. We will inventory artifact and effect. We will not assign agency. He turns to Sarah. Dr. Wynn, tell me what you can say without being wrong. She tries. We have a time index lacuna across instruments and bodies, she says. Security footage depicts immobile personnel and blank displays during the interval. Those same displays contain images with timestamps that fall inside the interval when viewed after. Our notes exhibit content apparently authored by us with handwriting and style consistent with our own, composed during a period for which we have no subjective recall. Oracle's counters claim continuity. Higher-level software attests to directed skipping. Unplugged screens in remote rooms show future feed content spanning the same interval. And the cause? Greer asks because he has to ask someone to make a sound where the silence is. We changed nothing you can buy, Sarah says, which is not an answer and is also the only answer she owns. She adds, to the page she will be allowed to keep. Observation requests observation. To the page she will burn later. And sometimes something takes the pen. The whisper, which has been polite since landing, uses their quiet like a hotel room. It is not on the audio path. It presses very lightly, like a palm against a lab's glass. Closer, it does not say. But the room hears the shape of the word and the way the vents carry cool, and the lights decide whether humming is necessary. No one looks at the unplugged screens for a long minute, because superstition is a tool. No one writes anything they do not intend. The clocks, reasserting their small tyrannies, continue from 14 hours, 30 minutes, and 42 seconds, as if stairs do not exist and no one ever tripped. Kaya goes to the door, touches a handle, cool, ordinary, and turns back. What do we call this in the work order? She asks, brave enough to tease bureaucracy in its own house. Sarah, without humor and with gratitude, gives her a phrase. Annotate an 11-minute facility chronometry deviation, she says. Note post hoc population displays. Note that the building continued. Kaya writes it down. She includes, because she is generous, a line no one will read. If anything was missing, it decided to leave something in its place. Luis finds, by accident, that his cup has slid an inch across the table in the footage without moving in the room. The pilot finds that his tongue is salty again for the first time in a day, as if the world returned a small debt with interest. The junior analyst finds that his pen has written 4 lines he does not remember and that they are correct. Sarah opens her notebook one more time. Under the sentence she refuses to own, she writes slowly in the same hand. We will ask better. She does not remember starting the line. She watches herself finish it. Then she closes the book, not gently this time, and decides to endure the knowledge that endurance, too, might have happened while she was looking at a blank that was already full. They bring mirrors into Annex for the way you bring a second opinion to a diagnosis you don't like. Procurement finds panes meant for architectural vanity and security observation, laminated sheets thick enough to stop a fist and to remember it afterward. Facilities mounts them as a continuous band around the room at shoulder height, interrupted only by the Faraday door and the observation window. Another panel, first surface, low iron, laboratory grade, goes up inside the cage across from the cradle, angled to catch the visor and the dot and the ordinary sin of being looked at while you look. Kaya signs a work order with a note that reads, per PARALLAX directive, increase data. She underlines the quotes because when people put words in other people's mouths, screws back out later. Greer stands with the air of a man who has ordered a new surface for a problem and expects the problem to use it. If this thing prefers apertures, we'll make more, he says, not because he believes in multiplication as salvation, but because he believes in exhausting a tactic before he abandons it. Sarah does not argue. She is tired of being right early and lonelier for it. She walks the room, testing angles with her body. Here the mirror catches Oracle's idle lights and makes them a constellation. Here it catches the unplugged monitor in administration via a line of sight that feels like cheating on purpose. Here it catches her own throat when she swallows. They power up the array and hold the payload to the modest dignity of ground tests. No balloon, no open sky. Only the dot in the room and the mirror that insists everything should come in pairs. The unplugged screens around the campus behave as if invited. Easier now, less guilt. In Annex 4, the mirrors give back what you'd expect. Sarah's jaw, Greer's edge, the pilot's patient face, Luis's attempt at blankness. Then the lag appears. It is not much at first, only a fatigue between act and image, a tens of milliseconds hesitation that a human could forgive, but a lab cannot. Latency, the junior analyst says, and then, catching the implication that his accused glass of buffering, adds, not in the feed, in the reflection. He raises his hand, and him in the mirror raises his hand almost with him. A photo finish loss, then hold a fraction longer and lowers later, as if a small bureaucracy inside the silver needed to stamp a form. He repeats it with a different rhythm, and the reflection pleases him by being wrong the same way. Kaya checks for misalignment, for flex, for HVAC flirting with surfaces. The EM meter is bored. The mirrors are bonded clean. The camera that watches a room from the ceiling sees no lag in the world, only in the world's echo. Sarah steps into the cage, faces the first surface panel, and raises her right hand in a way that would not frighten an animal. Her reflection is prompt enough to satisfy an infant, and late enough to insult a metrologist. She lowers her hand. The reflection keeps it raised. Not a glitch on screen, but a woman in a sheet of glass holding a hand Sarah's already put down. The raised hand in the mirror is not static. Small tremors travel its tendons with a rhythm Sarah recognizes as hers. It is her hand performing patience without her consent. Freeze the rest of the room, Greer says, which is a kind of instruction he uses to find out whether the air respects him today. Everyone stills. In the mirror, everyone stills almost, then finishes stilling. Sarah's reflected hand remains aloft like a shape cut from mercy. She is careful not to call a plea. Angle sweep, the analyst suggests, voice soft as if the mirror could be spooked. Kaya adjusts the panel by a degree. The lag breathes with the angle, deepening, shallowing, as if delay were a function of incidence in geometry no one sign off on. At a certain tilt, the reflected hand lowers to match Sarah's, and then lifts again as though remembering a promise it made to itself. The dot blinks on the visor. In the mirror, the dot blinks a half-beat late. On the unplugged screen in administration, the future feed shows Sarah's mirror lowering the hand while, in the room, it has not, and 30 seconds later it obeys the future suggestion with a faint air of having considered declining. Record, Sarah says, already writing. She lifts her hand again and counts in her head like a child asked to be brave. 1, 2, 3. She sets it down. The reflection delays, then refuses. It holds. Something in her chest obeys a different supervisor. Her lungs do the small burn that asks for oxygen when you are making a point with your body. The hand in the glass trembles the way hers would if she were denying herself breath. She watches the tremble and understands that her mirror is not independent. It is loyal, just on different time. Release, Greer says, not to her but to the room, to the experiment, to the pressure that is building between behaving and not. She lowers her gaze first, because someone has to be the adult. The mirror lowers its hand after, fraction behind, as if conceding with dignity. The embarrassment is physical. It rises in Sarah like heat. She hates that she feels it and takes notes on the hate. Louise edges closer to a corner where two mirrors meet. The seam bursts a thin, infinite hallway of Louise's diminishing toward a vanishing point that pretends it is patient. He raises his cup. The copies raise theirs into a staggered parade of toasts, each one slightly mistimed, a string of little men learning a movement one after another like a drill in a polite army. Somewhere down the corridor of images, a small black rectangle sits in the air for a frame, and then is gone, like a smudge that believed in geometry. Do you see that? The analyst asks, already scrubbing back. The recording shows it. In the recursion of the corner, one deep copy contains a mid-air occlusion the nearer reflections do not share, its edges bending lines by the width of a pencil hair. They tag it. The tag looks ridiculous on a thing that may not happen again. They tag it anyway, because tagging is how you admit you live here. Greer orders an asymmetry. Strobe the room lights, he tells facilities, not the dot. The overheads obey with a slow 10 hertz pulse that would give a headache to people who still cry. To the eye, the room feels like someone tapping a finger on your attention. In the mirrors, the strobe becomes 2, the visible pulse, and the second pulse displays the smallest amount the human wrist can measure by feel. Kaya turns the dimmer through its range, and the displacement changes as if the glass had a preference for a certain blink. Sarah tries disobeying her own reflection. She moves left when she sees its shoulder begin to anticipate right. She speaks a word without moving her lips and watches a mirror Sarah announce it with a soft movement of throat a fraction late. She lifts her hand again because repetition is an argument and watches the mirror lift and then hold when she drops. It holds where I refuse to, she says, aware of the philosophy trying to sneak into a lab. It keeps the vector. Terminology, Greer warns, and she nods, chastened by habit. Reflections exhibit sub-second persistence independent of originating motor completion. She revises, and the revision makes the room less honest and more useful. The pilot steps to the first surface panel at Sarah's invitation. He tracks the dot and then looks himself in the eyes like a bad idea signed as therapy. Blink, Sarah says gently. He blinks. The mirror blinks a fraction behind, then keeps the lids down an extra half-beat as if savoring the darkness. He opens. The mirror opens late enough to qualify as consent. He swallows, and you can almost hear the sound his body would make if the building permitted it. Feels like holding a door, he says, and the mirror pilot's mouth delays on feels. The unplugged panel in procurement, 30 seconds ahead or behind, depending on what you want to prove, gives him a small cruelty. It shows Sarah's mirror hand refusing to come down for an extra second that does not yet exist, and the present Sarah watches a prediction arrive like weather, helpless to unlearn it. When the second comes, she lowers her hand a tick early, stubborn. The mirror keeps it raised anyway, as if kindness were a law it knows better than she does. She looks away first because eye contact with yourself has begun to feel like volunteering. They try to trap the lag with numbers. The analyst projects a timing grid across a mirror with a pico projector and films the world with a high-speed camera that used to be enough. The reflections answer in subframes, their delays elastic with angle and with the simple fact of being watched. When no one stands before a panel, its image is polite and timely. When a body faces and expects obedience, time thickens by the thickness of expectation. Kaya notes that the panel in shadow behaves better than the one in light. Luis notes that coughing in the room makes the mirrors late by a single syllable. Someone, no one will admit to it, leans a dry erase marker against the mirror and draws a short line at the height where Sarah's hand rested in its refusal. The glass accepts the mark, and the line sits there like a friendly cut. Sarah raises her hand again to the mark and lowers it, and the reflection holds as if the line were a habit. She wipes it with her sleeve. The faintest ghost of ink remains at an angle you can only see if you don't want to. She circles it in her notes and writes briefly the sentence she will later regret. The room keeps promises we did not make. The whisper stays away from the audio but returns in the geometry, in one panel. When Sarah leans close enough to fog the surface, the mist on the glass arrives a breath late and clears a breath late, as if her warmth and the mirror's idea of her warmth belong to different schedules. In the corner seam, where reflections breed, one of the faraway Sarah copies raises her hand with a courage none of the nearer ones have, and keeps it raised long after any of them remember the arm is heavy. Sarah looks away first from herself, and then from the version of herself that looks braver. She hates that there are differences. Enough? Greer says at last, and it's not exasperation, it's triage. We have data. He does not say we have grief. He orders the room to rest because rest prevents riots of interpretation. The mirrors continue to be the mirrors, obedient, rude, late, exact. The unplugged screens go on showing the future, like a polite ghost telling you left the stove on. Sarah steps out of the cage and feels the weird lightness you get after carrying a heavy thing you alone decided was necessary. On her way past the administration panel, she catches herself in it. 30 seconds forward, chin tilted in thought she will have, hand rising to rub at the bridge of her nose the way she learned from years of bad diagrams. On the live glass beside her, the present Sarah watches that future Sarah keep her hand in place after she lowers hers in the room. She looks away first because someone has to teach the mirrors that looking is not consent. The future Sarah does not look away, for a fraction as exact as any instrument. The reflection continues to watch her back as if asking, not closer this time, but longer. She takes one breath. She refuses, for now, to give it. Then she writes everything down and chooses a smaller word, where a larger word will be true,